this sort of rational culture, I've been arguing, began in the Middle East. With the Axial Age actually began, I believe, in the Levant, in Phoenicia, in the Middle East. The Greeks, they were the John boys, they were the backward ones, they were the farm boys, and they were still living with their mythic culture. But then this rationalistic culture, this Axial Age, made its way into Greece. And for some reason, I think mainly because the Persian Empire came to dominate everything else, the Greeks not only learns the rational culture of the Middle East, they perfected it and began to expand beyond what they'd learned. But here we have it, this preceding mythic culture that we don't fully understand. We understand the rational culture, but we have all sorts of weird ideas of what was the mythical culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that's an important point to make, that it's very common as moderns to assume that the Greeks invented rationality and logic. But you're right, they encountered it. They encountered aspects of it among the Phoenicians, among the Babylonians, among the Egyptians, and they were determined to learn it, to catch up. This is part of their climb out of their own self-imposed dark age, right? Following the Trojan War and the Bronze Age collapse of civilizations, they looked back, saw how far they had fallen, were ashamed, and then were determined to embark on this cultural project to lift themselves up out of benightedness. They were obsessed with this idea. When why is Apollo such a prominent god? Well, he's not the god of the sun, is he? He's the god of enlightenment. They're determined to pull themselves out of benightedness and enlightenment, and they make the oracle at Delphi the sacred thing that unites all the tribes and all the nations. And in that climb, they're determined to learn what other cultures have learned. We've talked in the past about the way in which partially that was reflected at a religious level, the way that they wanted to know about other cultures' gods on the assumption that they probably were missing some and they needed to, learn about the divine, what other people knew about the divine. But as part of that, you don't get very far in Babylonian theology before you're running into Babylonian astronomy, right? And that becomes a unifying force with the Egyptian culture as well. They're obsessed with, the heliacal rising of the Pleiades, the Nile going to flood, and everything in Egypt is based on the calendar. And so the Greeks are getting into math, they're getting into astronomy, they're getting into systematic knowledge. They're borrowing their writing system from the Phoenicians, maybe via Cyprus. And as Shlomo writes in the Alphabet and the Goddess, there is a way in which a written culture becomes more linear and systematized compared to an oral culture. The fixedness of what you've written down lends itself to critique and evaluation. Was this the right thing to have written? Was it the wrong thing to have written? What are the proper ways to reason? What are the proper ways to record things? And start developing systematized thought that leads to logical thinking. So logos culture, which had to be developed anyway to support Babylonian astronomy, it finds its way into the Greeks, and they're obsessed with it. So this is one of Kenneth Smith's lines about why the Greeks, of all the ancients within the ancient epoch, why the Greeks? Why are they the ones that we keep going back to? And it's because they started writing things down while they still had one foot firmly planted in their earlier mythos culture. And so they do what almost no culture does, is they write their way through their transition from mythos culture to logos culture. And thus they reveal, in a Hegelian sense, right, the unfolding of the fruit. How does that transition happen is something you can only see if somebody's documenting the transition, which the Greeks were doing obsessively for a variety of reasons. So thanks, Stephen, for bringing that up. That's a really important point here. Joseph, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just, going to make a brief comment about the idea of systematizing cultures. and essentially, once cultures become literate and in written culture, essentially, there's a development of ritual that comes into play at a certain point. And this ritual starts to become the norm. And when these norms kind of come in, then this is where, kind of you're making this transition to certain types of logic and belief systems. And even in the sense of, I was thinking in terms of religious beliefs. Oftentimes, this is where, religious texts and dogmatic texts, actually not religion in the sense the way Kenneth Smith is talking about it, obviously, but more religious in the sense that more of how a more dogmatic culture could kind of come in and dominate how the thinking, the rational thinking of the time, so to speak. Anyway, that's just that's something of interest, I think, and significance. So.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, that's an important point. These questions about what is the transition from an oral culture to a written culture look like? What happens to the culture in the process of documenting and systematizing its decision making? You get some very interesting things. And in part, this is all tangled up. For Heraclitus and other Greeks, this is all tangled up with issues of how do we avoid civil war? How do we avoid breaking apart back into factions again? Because they're keenly conscious of the way that they had fallen from a world power at the time of the Trojan War to, at the Dark Ages, they were just a bunch of warring tribes. You see these stories they tell about Polyphemus eating Odysseus's crew, and you read in other plays, satyr plays and other places as well. There are, and Robert Graves talks about this too, there are some not all that covert references to cannibalism. They believe they have fallen way too far, and they're terrified of that abyss. And so it makes them want to consciously shape themselves, want to engage in what do I want to say? They want to weld the fragments together into a whole, and they believe to become a larger group again. That is a whole organism that is a cosmos and not a chaos. They see that as directly connected to what you're talking about, the issues of kind of becoming systematized, becoming rational, documenting what they're doing, and making rules for proper reasoning and persuasion. They in the art of shifting, as Nietzsche talks about, from conflict to contest, right, as part of their strategy to avoid fighting with each other, to shift to the Olympian Games and so on. They're shifting from a focus on mere strength to persuasion, patho. Kenneth Smith makes a big point. From the Agora in Athens, you could see the statue of Patho, the goddess of persuasion, that had been erected along with the other charities right up above where you could see them. And that was to remind people that even in the contest of the marketplace for who got the best deal, you had to remember that the reason you're doing any of this is in order to pull ourselves together and come out of the depths of the Dark Age. And so the more you're obsessed with patho, the more you're focusing on, well, how do you persuade people? What are the rules for civilized discussion? And so again, it's sort of, there's buried within the immediate goals, the culture, anthropocultural goals that they had, are all these implications for the spread of a noesis approach to reasoning and decision making. It's all bound up there, and it creates opportunities for, populists, sophists, and so on to rise to power. And they don't see that part of it coming until it's too late. I mean, by the time they're putting Socrates on trial for contributing to the spread of sophistry, they're already knee deep in the Peloponnesian War, and everything's going to hell. And it's everything that they didn't want to happen is happening, and they're still trying to work out. I mean, it's left to Aristotle to be writing afterwards. Why did this all happen? How could we have blundered into the very thing we were trying to avoid? But they're related to each other organically, This is the tricky thing that ancients are better at seeing, even though they're not perfect at seeing than moderns are. So we worship our will to such an extent we believe going for what you want will mostly lead either to getting what you want or not getting it yet, and then you have to work harder to get it. But the idea that getting what you want could cause all of the problems to follow, which is the lesson of Oedipus Tyrannus. This is, we're not used to thinking of our own desires with that level of skepticism that comes naturally to the ancients. And so the ways in which, the very effort to undo a dark age could lead to the next dark age is that going from death to birth to flourishing to aging to death is a natural metaphor for an epoch that thinks in terms of organisms and life cycles. It's not natural to an epoch machines and perpetual status quos like we do, believing that we live at the end of history. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I acknowledge that the Greeks learned a great deal from the Babylonians and the Egyptians as well. So it did come from the Middle East, from Mesopotamia and the Levant. However, I thought the main difference was that the Greeks not only learned those techniques, that concept, those techniques, for both the Babylonians and the Egyptians, it was done in praxis. In other words, working it out, right? But the Greeks took it a step further and turned it into a kind of self-enclosed theory that, in a sense, could be projected forward. So that's different. You have to acknowledge that is different, because that self-enclosing loop performs a theory that reinforces itself. And so whereas like with just mere praxis, there's always plenty of room to move around to a certain degree. As long as it works. So that is different. Without that step, then in a sense,
right,
you can't, in a sense, have a stabilized situation as it is. Now, the question is whether that theory is actually an expression, and to what degree is expression of a representation of the world as it is, and to what degree is a projection of the inner psyche to want to match it. And right. I think that's where the question comes from, is like, so if we were concerned with the interrelationship between the psyche and the world, then in a sense, that is an equivocal question. And I think maybe the Greeks did knit that together in a way that was not necessarily the case, in the Middle East. So you could really argue, in a sense, that they at least added a very instrumental step, in the rational structure.
Yeah.
The question is that where does that rational structure lie? In a sense, it probably as much embedded in the culture as it was in the representation of, because the Greeks were so concerned with the culture, and in a sense, the way you talk about it in that way, it's an ecosystem in itself, And one of the things, I was going to mention it, although I'm skipping ahead, but I think it's appropriate for this case. So if you go to the oracles in Delphi, and apparently Socrates did, and the number one edict is to know thyself.
Right.
Not to know the world, to know thyself.
Yes.
So that means that in order to know the world, you have to first straighten out your psyche, yourself. And so therefore it begins with that. And, in some sense, that was also an important aspect, because if you look at it that way, it does, in a sense, begin to emphasize the individuation of the individual, because with the Babylonians and the Egyptians in particular, you don't have to know yourself. You just have to follow the rules. Only the Pharaoh needs to know himself. That's all. So I think that's also another tremendous difference. Maybe I shouldn't call it an advancement, a difference, because in some sense it means that more of the relationship between the cosmos and the individual is within the psyche itself, because you have to first know yourself. And the secondary effect is to know the world. After you know yourself, then you could begin to understand the world, because it's all filtered through you.
Yeah.
And, you and your relationship, of course, with your community. So the self in the Greeks was not isolated in the self, although I sits there, but nonetheless, there's a kind of entanglement with the community. So it's spread out. The self is spread out in the community, but it's still a collective psyche. You want to call it that way. So
yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's intrinsic to this that people in that era, expressed differently than this era, but actually the same goal expressed differently, are constantly trying to predict and thereby bind the future. Right? We want that magical power to control the future, at least by knowing it. And people would go to oracles on the assumption that the oracle was going to tell you about the future. And right there on the doorstep of the oracle, right on that stone pillar, it says, know thyself. And it's so easy for someone to overlook the fact that what they're saying is, before you even worry about the future, the question is, how about the present? Who are you right now? What are the filters you bring to the way that you see the world? Why would you even want to asking? What does that tell you about yourself? The king of Persia comes in and says, if I attack the Greeks, will I succeed? And the oracle replies, well, a great empire will fall. And the king of Persia hears what he wants to hear and says, great, I want that great empire to fall. And of course, the oracle never said it was the Greek empire that was going to fall, but the king of Persia doesn't know himself, and he's not thinking. He thinks of himself as being in charge of the mightiest of institutions and organizations of his era, which is how he would be characterized, by generations later, and can't conceive of that he and his institutions are also mortal, because all people and all human institutions are mortal.
I think there must be something wrong with that translation of the oracle, because if the oracle actually say a great empire would fall, the Persian Empire was the only empire, right? I mean, you couldn't hardly call the Greeks a bunch of city-states as an empire. So there's something wrong with that translation, because otherwise it would be self-evident. Right. Oh, you mean the empire? That must be us. So
right. Yeah, I would need the Greek words in front of me to pin it down.
That's right. I
don't know if it was kingdom or empire, but yeah. So there's that thing, right? Is this one of the things that Kenneth Smith talks about is that the kinds of, and he draws this out of Hegel and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and others, when people develop into the mode of character in which they over rely on systematized thought, they don't realize the extent to which they're also over trusting their own will. Right? The purpose of the systematized thought is to produce predictable results. Why do we care about E equals MC squared? So that we know ahead of time what's going to happen when we light off the bomb, how much energy is going to be released. The whole point is to bind the future. That's what systematized thinking is for. And as Hegel says, that's why we develop what he calls Verstand. That's why we develop the noetic faculty. Gnosic faculties we're born into, is because we're tired of pooping ourselves. We're tired of being hungry. We want to know when mom's coming home. So we start to develop our predictive capacities. We start to systematize our understanding of the world, and time and rhythm and pattern and number and all these things are implicit to that. There is Kenneth talks about that it leads to a mode of thought that is impatient with things that don't lead to immediate practical results. right? Practical results being, how does this get me what I want? Right. I don't want to question whether what I want is going to lead to catastrophe. I want it. Right. I don't have time for that namby-pamby, the world's going to end stuff. I don't care, says Shell, right? I don't care if pursuing what we're doing right now destabilizes the whole world climate. It doesn't matter to us. What matters is if we don't get these profits today, our competitors will get it. So we're going to get them today. Also, the profits are amazing. So who cares what happens later? That's a tomorrow problem. We don't do tomorrow problems. And in this way, this is just an example of the typical ways that people who are heavily leaning into their noesis are impatient. They want practical, immediate results. And by wanting that, it puts them in a position of being blind to the ways in which they're creating their own problems. And this is what Know Thyself is trying to hold up a mirror to do to people, to say is, long before you should be asking about the future or what you want, you should be questioning what you want. And who are you to want the healthy? As Heraclitus says, it would not be better for men if they got what they wanted. We got to question our wants and investigate, what the consequences are. So anyway, let's call on Stephen, and then I'll take us to the text. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, the other historical element, there's been plenty of collapses in the Civil War. The famous one in England was the War of the Roses. And of course, that was at one point for the English schoolboy, he was dragged through the War of the Roses, a disagreeable experience, but it was drummed into them. You look at the Tudor period, the Tudor monarchs, the whole period was full of that sense of tragedy, that the whole basis for their power was, we're here to prevent the War of the Roses happening again. And that whole period was dominated by it. But then again, you have the Stuarts come in and they don't know the lesson and they end up in the same situation again. And looking at America, years ago, I used to study a lot of investment material. I was curious about where the market was going. In 2003, I could figure out the market was going to crash around 2008. There were the classic phases there, but the market was telling you all through those years, not this time, baby, we're not crashing. And you think, oh, that was a good prediction I made. But I look back, no, it was classic. The classic fall was there. But something I was studying in all this material, you'd come up with things where a guy, businessman was saying, when I was a kid, the Republicans and the Democrats disagreed with each other, but they would go and have a beer with each other and discuss their families. And now they're like two bitter camps. And I thought about that and I checked history, and sometimes history does rhyme. And you look at the period of the Roman Republic in the 2nd century when they defeated the Carthaginians. And you can see the moral decline in the Romans. Once they got power, this moral decline occurred. You should look at the behaviour of the Romans at the end of the Second Punic War and how they're behaving at the time of the Third Punic War. Simply 50 years, and at the end of the Second Punic War, they allow the Carthaginians to keep their city. Third Punic War, they go there to wipe them out. A huge change in moral behaviour. When they're occupying Greece in the Second Punic War, they explain to the Greeks, we're only here temporarily. We're not here to take control of you. And they did, they left. Then 50 years later, they're invading Greece and burning down cities. And you look at that period when the Gracchi brothers arose and you see that turning point. It's so similar to what America is today. And so many years ago, 20, 15 years ago, I was looking at those problems, about 20 years ago. And I was thinking, I could imagine by about the year 2030, it'll be obvious that America will be two armed camps against each other. Emotionally, I couldn't understand it. I'd always conceived of the Americans as being a unity. Now, so many years later, I'm seeing it. And it's more emotionally understandable because it's become a fact. Years ago, I couldn't accept it. Now it's become obvious. And I would warn here people who think that this division is a simple thing that you only have to plaster over it. Historically, no. When you see that division, it doesn't go away. It deepens, it gets worse. The most dangerous thing at the moment is to say there is a simple solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, this issue of, do we understand ourselves? Can we question ourselves enough to re-examine the trajectory that we're on? You know, it's hard for Americans because we believe that what we want is inherently good, so we should get what we want. And the only question is, what do we have to do to get it? This is what the marketplace teaches us, and it's what school teaches us to prepare us to be good consumers and producers. And none of this works if people are questioning consumption itself and whether it is good to always want more. There is a way in which the is at direct odds with what's healthy for people, and these are things Heraclitus talks about, right? And these are well-known old problems in the ancient world, but they are problems that are almost suppressed out of existence in the modern world. You can find your culture critics who will, you know, laugh and point out commercials and how absurd they are, but none of that makes its ways to the halls of government. We still govern ourselves as though we have no critical faculties for restraining ourselves when it comes to our desire. You know, when Diogenes says, for the proper conduct of life requires right reason or a leash, you know, he's following up on these things, saying, you know, if we can't control ourselves, then the thing we need more than anything is for somebody else to control us, because somebody has to restrain us, lurching out at everything that catches our eyes. So with all that as our warm up for the first half hour, let's go to the text. So what we're talking about here is the term myth, and we're talking about the term myth because to a modern, myth means a lie. It might also be a story. It might also be entertaining. It might also be something people believe, but it's a lie. That's what it fundamentally means. And we're the epoch of history that believes it sees the world more clearly than anybody ever has, that we're more logical, more educated, more advanced, more scientific, etc., than any culture ever was. And ergo, we have no patience for myths. Myths are things you sell consumers in order to make money, but that you don't fall for yourself. You have to be more rational than that. So, but you know, it's hard for moderns to question their view of the world. So if we think that that's what myth means, then we think it means that inherently, objectively, for all time, and it always has. But the Greeks believed that the information available to us in nature comes in at least two different flavors. There's the information that is trivially available to anybody who looks, and then there is the information that is very difficult to find. Heraclitus says nature loves to hide. Below the surfaces of things in nature, there are deep laws and principles that make nature unfold the way that it does. And those laws and principles are not obvious to every observer. In fact, they may be, for most observers, non-existent at all. Most people in the world see the things that happen and take them all at face value without worrying themselves about whether there's some deeper principle at work, some archai, as the Greeks would say. And the Greeks believe, as Kenneth Smith is arguing in this opening paragraph, that logos, i.e. noesis forms of thought, lend themselves to the trivialities of nature, but have a very tough time with the deeper principles. They can find simplistic laws that always behave the same way everywhere, but have a very hard time finding laws that express themselves differently in every place. And you can see this when you cross the gap from math and physics and chemistry on the one hand into cellular biology, organismic biology, ecosystems. the ability to generate simple equations that are always true the same way in all places at all times begins to collapse. And we find ourselves, it's part of why in the modern epoch, you can find a lot of people who, if you say biology, they assume you mean genetics, because genetics reduces it back down to chemistry, where they can get simple propositions and mathematically, it lends itself to noesis. But you start talking about complex feedback mechanisms in forest ecosystems over thousands of years, and that's not equation based, right? That's based on these kinds of dynamic systems that Heraclitus and Hegel and others talk about, which are adaptive rather than being mechanically predictable. Respond in an organismic way to shifts around them. And that every time they do that, they violate whatever equation you just finished setting up for them. There is no status quo. There is what I kind of term a fluxus quo, in which it is constantly shifting in order to maintain its own health. So the argument of this paragraph is that the ancients fully understood that the gnosis mode of thought, in which is focused on experiential knowledge, is every bit as important as the noesis mode of thought, which is focused on logic and math and other kinds of systematic thinking. And that if you try to do one without the other, or one dominating the other, you're going to end up being, the protagonist in a tragedy. So the key would rise, speaking now from an ancient Greek perspective, as we seek to rise out of the Dark Age catastrophe that we unleashed upon ourselves. We are doing that through noesis. We're planning. We're being systematizing. We're re-engineering our own religion. We're re-engineering our own culture, our own laws. Everything is now being put under scrutiny and organized and systematized in order to help lift us up. But as we do that, we don't want to become wholly noesis, because then we would lose the strengths of gnosis, right? And that would be some new kind of catastrophe, like in Oedipus, Tyrannus, right? Where he is the cleverest of men, but he doesn't know the behind himself. His unconscious, what he doesn't know is what leads to the catastrophe. It doesn't matter how smart he is. In fact, the smarter he is, the greater the catastrophe that will result, because of because of his disregard for the unknown and the unconscious and the irrational. So this is one of those places where the Greeks have a very different conception of the human mind and human character and human culture than moderns do. Because as moderns, we're trying to make the perfect system of laws in which nobody needs any free will at all. They can call themselves free while by law being bound to do precisely what the law tells them to do, and becoming the perfect cogs in a great machine that runs smoothly and never gets anything wrong. There's this tension between the way we govern ourselves and what we claim for ourselves as our freedom and all that. This blind spot is inherent to the modern epoch and how it conceives of the world, whereas to the ancients, except for vicissitudes and blindness from one person to another, in general, the default was in the ancient world to understand this tension in human perspective and human reasoning. And thus mythos culture myth was not seen as a lie, as he's saying, as he's arguing here. Rather than being seen as a lie, it was seen as the complement to science and logic and math and reason. It's the part for getting at the deeper, darker, unconscious, irrational things that govern over us. And that if we didn't have it, then we would have no grasp at all. We would only be grasping to obvious, simple things and completely missing the deeper currents. And thus, we would be Oedipus, setting ourselves up for some hideous catastrophe. That's what they were afraid of. Phil, go ahead. Come off mute.
Yeah, I have a question about that. It's and I'm not quite sure where it goes in this sense. Like, the Greeks understood that human beings have a psyche, and I guess that migrated to a soul. So therefore, there's a separate system in which the soul interacts with other souls and create a kind of a community, a kind of ecosystem, you could say, right? So they understand that, because we understand that Greeks does not isolate the self from others, because it diffuses into the community, at least to a certain degree. So that relationship is well established. But I wonder whether the Greeks actually understood that there's also a kind of ecology in nature itself. And if they understood that, it would be very different from, in a sense, the moderns, in a sense, because it isn't until recently that we begin to even sense that there was a ecosystem that was beyond a lot of singularity of fishes doing whatever they do, whatever that is. And if the Greeks understood that relationship, that the nature also have a soul, then I suppose it was the the reduction of logos that we lost that understanding. And we have to take a lot of time. I mean, I guess in some sense, almost 2,000 years thereabout before we discovered nature's soul, right? And particularly in the intervening period, when, oh no, nature is just an expression of God, and God actually controls this thing, So I could understand being confused, because you understand the elk, you understand the horse, you understand the pig, you understand all these things because it's an objective fact that's in the world. You didn't know that a pig was related to the horse, to the grass, all of that stuff. You do understand that the horse eats grass and all that, but you didn't understand the complexity of that entire system. That's kind of a little bit like learning how to play basketball, and you learn how to dribble, or you learn how to shoot the basket, but you didn't understand the complex relationship of all the other players and how they move, and how it's like, yeah, you could do the set shot real good, if you had a chance to do it, you'll make it every time. But that doesn't mean you're going to ever get the ball, because you don't know how to move in relationship to the dynamics of the system itself, right? So I don't know whether losing that, you could ever have an understanding of the ontology of the system that mitigates, that relates directly to the complexity, because a system is not a singular soul, but all these souls put together into a system. So I guess I just want to ask, to what degree the Greeks understood that the world has a soul, and to what degrees they understood that and we lost it, or what they never really had a clear understanding, and therefore we inherit that ambiguity.
Those are great questions. So part of what's central to the ancient worldview is that the fundamental metaphor is not an object but an organism. Thinking, if you look at something random around you, rather than thinking, oh, there's a chair and it's a thing, you say there's a chair and it's an organism. That chair is got the qualities of an organism. And one of the things that he's talked about in the earlier sections in chapter 4 is that a big part of that is, to what extent can the chair keep itself going? This was one of the things they identified as being a central feature of an organism as opposed to an object. I mean, a dried out hunk of clay has no ability to hold itself together. You knock it around and it falls to pieces. It's not an organism in any meaningful sense. Or let's say it has a very small modicum of life, right? Until it gets completely crumble away. But under the influence of even a little, whether it's pressure or sun or what have you, it collapses. So it has very little life, but that's still the metaphor that they're thinking of. There is a weak little organism that can't keep itself together. And then you look at a lion and its ability to run away from greater threats and to feed itself and so on. And you see that it has a larger amount of life. Its organismic value is greater. But they're still united in both being organisms. And as organisms, each one has its own character, which is the stamp upon its soul that determines, the kinds of things that it wants and that it notices and doesn't notice, and so on, and the kinds of solutions it tries to come up with for its problems. Now, obviously, the lump of clay doesn't have much in the way of activity for solving its problems, which is why the Greeks are using the term animate to distinguish the things that can actually more actively move and act in order to preserve themselves than the things that can't. But the Greeks are still seeing both of them as being essentially organisms to some extent, having a soul, having a character, and having some kind of relationship, even though they didn't have the term, some kind of relationship of sympathecy with the world around them. Everything is learning, it's sensing, it's learning, it's reacting, it's shifting itself in order to perpetuate itself. And the things that do that better are more alive than the things that do that less well. But it's the fundamental metaphor, and it's all driven by the idea of a soul and a character, because the character is where the lawfulness comes from in something that makes it act the way that it does.
Well, even if they understood that, okay, I'll take your word for it, because it does make sense. It's a living organism. Isn't there like a kind of complexity or contradiction, even, that in a sense, this thing that was formerly a wild horse, you could switch it from one ecosystem to another ecosystem, domesticate it, and there was an urgency to domesticate, for own survival, right? So there's a conflict instead of saying, oh, a horse is a horse, let it be a horse, that's it, we'll mind our own business. but the interaction between the two systems seems to me there's a kind of a conflict there.
Oh, yeah.
Because it leads naturally to, on the one hand, understanding it has a soul, but on the other hand, you do want to colonize it.
Right.
In order for your own survival, for
Yes.
your own ecosystem in some sense. So I mean, we certainly do colonize. I mean, not just human beings, but way before that, into nature itself. So yeah, so it's not as if the Greeks were virtuous all around, but they didn't respect the souls of the otherness of nature to the degree that we think maybe they should have. So I don't know. I mean, it's like, but there is an urgency for us to survive, and so therefore,
right,
we have to violate the rules of the cosmos to a certain degree.
I mean, what's highly relevant. I mean, the moment you start acknowledging the character of all the things around you and their own sympathecy and desire to go on, it ups the stakes on colonization, right? Because now you're not just like at the height of Skinnerian and post-Skinnerian behaviorism, there were people proposing that even people don't have feelings or a will or anything, that even people are just machines to be programmed. And that level of dehumanization makes it easy to do what you want to people, because after all, they're unpeople. Nobody's a person. Right? If you don't have to respect any human rights if there's no human beings. There's just these machines, and you just program them to do what you want. It's easier to do or industrialized slavery as long as other people are abstractions. But you have to understand, if the Greeks not only envisioned the reality of other people's wills and personalities and characters, but even the horses, even the rivers and the mountains. Here too there are gods, says Heraclitus at his campfire at night when he's approached. All around, everything has souls and spirits and divinities. It's all sacred. So, if you run around chopping off heads, which the Greeks did a lot of, if you're chopping off the heads of abstractions, it doesn't feel like you're doing much wrong. But if you're sacking Miletus and killing everybody there, then, and you have the ancient modern worldview, The only way you can do that is if you have a level of bloodthirstiness that's difficult for moderns to conceive of. And Nietzsche writes about this. He says it's one of the ways in which moderns can't comprehend the ancient Greeks, is the ancient Greeks had a lust for life that included all of the parts that the medieval epoch teaches us are wrong, because they also had a lust for murder and rape. And they didn't want to unleash that within their own polis or unlawfully. The laws told them when they could and when they couldn't. But when you were at war, they relished the opportunity to be a sacker of cities and destroy, everything that those people had built for. This is part of the ancient worldview, actions that for us are easy abstractions. For them, they had to have some scary juices pumping in their veins. So, all right, let's kill that sacred thing. Let's slaughter it. In the Aeneid by Virgil, when he's the first book of parables by Kenneth Smith, Otherwise, he gives you the source of the title in a little quote from the Aeneid, the gods deemed otherwise, and it's from the part where the Greeks are invading the sacred temple in Troy, and there's people to the goddess or god right there. They're in the sacred space. The sacred law is you do not harm people in that precinct. And besides which, the person praying was the best of the Trojans, according to Aeneas, according to Virgil. The character of Aeneas in Virgil's epic at the time is saying that guy was the most noble of us. He honored the gods the most. He was the bravest. He was the most virtuous, and they cut him down like he was a dog, because even though we thought he was the best, the gods deemed otherwise. And inherent in that scene, what's hard for moderns to understand is the level of understanding an ancient brings to bear. How bloodthirsty did the Greeks have to be to not only kill someone that they saw as being sacred, but in a sacred precinct where what they were doing was an abomination to be damned by the gods, but they couldn't help themselves because their juices were flowing. That's how much they wanted to murder. They're just like, I don't care if none of us makes it home to Greece. I don't care if over the next 10 years on our returns we all meet with tragedy. I got to kill this guy. I want it so bad. And Nietzsche talks about this. He says this is part of what moderns can't understand about ancients. How could they be like that? Well, they could be like that because they didn't blind themselves to what they were doing the way moderns do. We erase the significance of everything to make it easy to do what we want. But the ancients didn't erase the significance of what they were doing. They just embraced. Creepy as hell. Creepy as, and we're in Hannibal Lecter territory at that point, right? In some sense, the psychology involved is really difficult for us to grok, and that's Nietzsche's point in his essay. Donald and Stephen, and I'll take us back to the text. Go ahead, Donald.
Something that you guys said in your discussion, this made me think in modern literature, dramatic literature, we often look for the tragic flaw as the driver, what undoes the protagonist. But the Greeks, I think, would have looked for the tragic virtue, the tragic excellence. Oedipus didn't get into all this trouble because of his flaw. He got into it because of his singular excellence that he had. I'm going to mute it.
The most clever of men, the one who could solve the riddle of the Sphinx that no one else could solve. Which I got to say, I think Sophocles fell down a little bit when he was making that particular riddle be the riddle in his play. There are more difficult riddles by far. I think people don't. It makes it so that people underestimate Oedipus. And what has to be understood is that Oedipus is the clever. He's so smart. He's so willful and clever. That's why he rises so fast. And if he hadn't risen so fast, none of the terrible things would have happened. right? To moderns, tragedy doesn't mean anything. Anything is a tragedy. Oh, stubbed my toe, what a tragedy. Or somebody died of a heart attack, what a tragedy. People die of heart attacks all the time. That is not a tragedy. It may be terrible. We may grieve it. We may suffer because it happened. But to the Greeks, that's not a tragedy. A tragedy is specifically when you enter the situation where your virtues become your undoing. That state of tragic inversion in which if you weren't so good, this story wouldn't have come out so badly. It's the master digger who can dig himself into the deepest hole he can't get out of. And you know, a mediocre digger can't get himself into that kind of trouble. The hole he can dig is a mediocre hole he can still get out of. It is when your virtues are the source of your calamity that you're in a tragedy. So, and you can look in vain for this. You Google on the internet, you read the Wikipedia article on tragedies, and they don't really want to talk about tragic inversion. They want to say, oh yeah, some bad shit happened. This is a story in which, you know, and they'll nibble around the edges of it such that if you're not studying it, you might think they're saying the same thing we are. But if you look specifically for tragic inversion, look for a description of a state in which all your strengths work against you, and you find it's nowhere. Nobody wants to talk. Moderns don't like this idea at all. We don't like the idea that what we want isn't good for us, and we don't like the idea that our strengths could be our undoing. But to the Greeks, this was not only widely understood, it was the dominant form of one of the two dominant forms of theater in ancient Greece. They didn't have television, right? They're being entertained and enlightened all the time by being reminded over and over and over. Your strengths can become your weaknesses. You be careful of what you want. The gods have a different wisdom from your wisdom. You are mortal. Julius Caesar, right? The figure standing next to Caesar, whispering in his ear, "You too are mortal. Beware the Ides of March." Right? The idea of standing someone next to, you know, a prime minister or premier or president of the modern epoch to constantly be saying, "You're not so great. You're mortal. You'll be dead soon." No modern government would do that. We hate this idea. But when Shakespeare has that happening in his play Julius Caesar, that's not artistic license. The ancients really did want to keep memento mori, the reminder of death and finitude and mortality, in front of them at all times, because lose track of that is the moment in which you set yourself up for tragedy. You start to think that you can just will things the way a god could will things. That's a mistake, because we're finite. We're just full of errors. And the greater our power grows, the greater it magnifies the impact of our errors. Stephen, go ahead.
Something that keeps on coming up is this inability to distinguish between objective and subjective. Something that was better known even 100 years ago or 200 years ago. You argue with the modern rationalists, and they're saying how wonderful is our objective knowledge of the universe. And I say, but look back at your subject. What is your instrument of viewing the universe? It is the fourth ape. They seem to think that their objective view of the universe cancels out any problems they have with the subjective ape. And I think an element, the moderns, you know, are very proud of the Enlightenment. And they say it's reason. But these previous cultures had reason as well. The Socratic Greeks had reason. The church, you look at the stuff the church was writing in the Dark Ages, and there was a rational comment that would test the modern mind. History for the past 2,500 years has been full of rationalism, and yet we have this Enlightenment say, no, we are the rational ones.
We're the first rational ones.
And what I would say, and it's what what was pointed out about the modern humanists came from the transcendentalists. And this is a thing, when you think about it, all these hubristic views that cultures will have of themselves is not rational, it's transcendental. When we say that we're a modern, we've arisen from the ugly past of the rich trials, we know how to do things better. We are practicing a transcendental view that has really nothing directly to do with rational thought. And yet they think that they are the product of rational thought.
Yeah.
They are unable to grasp that their view is essentially a mythic one, a religious one, that we've reached the pinnacle. We are the first people in history to be fully enlightened, and that enlightenedness will change us, will make us rise up over our lesser nature so easily. You don't actually have to think. You just have to walk down the market, satiate all your desires, and you'll have the perfect existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, so this sets us up perfectly for the text, right? So the text here is talking about this other side of human nature, this subjective side, and recognizing the subjective side as something we're going to talk about and not deny, something we're not going to pretend we don't have. That to pretend we're rational is to pretend we're not human. That to be human, we are more than rational. We are also irrational. And that both faculties are busy in us all the time. Well, in fact, not all the time, because we're asleep at night, right? So, but our irrational side is still busy. We're dreaming as it works out things without permission of the rational mind, establishing the meanings and the priorities. And the next day, our rational mind is running around thinking that it's making all the choices, but it's only noticing the things, as we talked about a few weeks ago, that the irrational mind, i.e. our character, has decided are of interest to us. That in an infinite cosmos, when you've got a brain that can only focus on 7 plus or minus time, almost everything is decided before your rational mind is even engaged. It's decided by what is not noticed and what is noticed. Almost everything has been pushed into the background by our character, by our irrational mind. Selecting, it's like one of what they used to call banana republic elections, where you can vote for any of these choices, but they've all been picked for you in advance. So how free are you? Well, we can see it when it's a banana republic election, but we can't see it when it's our own rational mind claiming to be, seeing with perfect, pure, objective reason without ever questioning why were these the questions that I was asking and not the infinite number of other questions to ask. Who picked this slate of interests for me? And the answer is the part of yourself that you deny even exists, the irrational side. And this is why, going back to Kenneth Smith's paragraph, myth means something different to the ancients than it means to a modern. To a modern, it means, the bad, irrational lies, and maybe it's fun for selling some product, but, don't do any of that. We're beyond that. It's primitive. It's a foolish, as Carl Sagan said in Cosmos, myth was a failed primitive attempt at reason and science. They just didn't understand the world well enough. But if we pour, the head full of more understanding, then we become educated and rational and wise and good and all these. The idea that doesn't work, that memorized facts and equations only apply to half of our brain, the faculty of noesis, and do not really do much of anything for the other half of our brain, gnosis. And furthermore, that noesis develops on top of gnosis and remains dependent on gnosis for our entire lives to set the framework of what we notice and don't notice. This is inconceivable in the framework of what Carl Sagan describes for us in Cosmos. I love Cosmos. I love the show. And I like the follow-up as well. Andrianne, of course, has a credible role to play in both Cosmos series. She's not often recognized for, but built into it is almost a perfect statement of what Stephen's talking about, with ultra-rationalism as being the solution to all problems. And in that is a huge blind spot, which is who is making the claim to see things as they actually are. What ape is this, right, that evolved to understand a banana far more effectively than we can understand a banana tree or a banana ecosystem or all the rest of the infinite things that the banana is a part of? There is this way in which, you know, the strengths of logos culture, the strengths of noesis have taken us a long way into being able to do things we never conceived of, like walking on the moon. But it's also taking us a long way into doing things we never would have wanted to do, like world wars and, you know, the Holocaust and so on. These are all products of reason, just like what. And it's because we're ultra rationalists that we can't understand how those two things both come from neglecting gnosis and overemphasizing noesis. So before I call on Phil, I'm going to actually start quoting some of these sentences from Kenneth Smith's essay. We should actually get into it a little, because this is the point he's building on. So Greek myth, not the modern concept of myth, but the ancient concept of myth, was the confluence of many folk tales and the assimilation of one deity to another, nearly the same. So the focus here is that there have been a lot of wisdom stories being passed around from traditional cultures, right? The Greeks of the classical era are a welding together of many groups of people who as separate. They've all got their own religions. They've all got their own folk tales and wisdom stories. And the Olympian project to end the Dark Age and to rise into the classical era is picking and choosing and welding together. And it's having to do it not by saying our God is real and your God is fake. That's a medievalism. That's how the medieval epoch works, not the ancient epoch. In the ancient epoch, they're saying your God so-and-so resembles our God so-and-so. So maybe this is the same God with two different names. But your God so-and-so, we don't have a name for. So why don't we just bring him in and we'll add him? And so there's this process of consolidation and combination, the creation of a pantheon. When we read Edith Hamilton's mythology or Bulfinch's mythology or any of these other classic, depictions of Greek mythology, the pantheon is portrayed as a fait accompli. That's just how it was. There just happened to be a pantheon of 12 Olympian gods. And you can see as you read on that there's more gods than the 12. Right? There's seemingly an endless number of them. And eventually it turns out every river is a god, every mountain is a god, every forest is a god, all the different streams of the oceans. There's gods coming out of our ears, right? There's gods everywhere. But the fact that these 12 were picked out, we don't think to ask ourselves, why these 12? And when did that happen? And how did that happen? Well, it happened deliberately through creation of the Olympian pantheon, the Olympian project to try to pull out of the Dark Age. This is not something Edith Hamilton or Bulfinch is going to talk about. So they don't understand this. They're moderns. They take it as a given, as an object, not as an organism that has grown through some process of maturation. So they don't ask themselves the question, where did this come from? How did it come to be this way? So he's saying they assimilate the deities one to another where they can, and where they can't, they accrete, they add the additional deities. We know that Aphrodite was not originally a goddess of the Greek peninsula. We know from the history that she came from Cyprus and maybe farther away, and she was imported into the Greek religion. And she was imported to such an extent she was made one of the 12. She pushed out other deities that were more native to the Greeks. Took this process of accumulation of their religion. They would even push their own deities aside to make way for deities that because if you don't have anything like Aphrodite in your religion and you meet another people that does have something like Aphrodite in your religion, it's going to rock you back on your heels. You're like, oh my God, they're totally right. Attraction and beauty do have the power to take over human minds. I mean, I can have all the other virtues, but if I'm not paying attention to the power that attraction and beauty have over me, I'm going to be blindsided. How many times in history was somebody blindsided through attraction who had seemingly all the other power at their disposal? So the Greeks look at that and say, our pantheon's defective. We have to fix it. Bring an Aphrodite right on in. And we know they did this because this happened in prehistorical, but barely prehistorical times. In historical times, they're still talking about the fact that she came from outside, that they brought her in. And so it is with some of the others, right? So we know there is this process of deliberate accumulation, and we know there's this process of assimilating, We see it with the Romans, right? The Romans say our Mercury is like your Hermes, so let's just say they're the same deity. Right, our Jupiter is like your Zeus, so let's just say they're the same deity. The Romans are doing the exact same thing later on that the Greeks were doing earlier. It is natural to the ancient approach to religion to be polytheistic and to be on the hunt so that you can get the correct, complete pantheon of the deities you need to focus on. It says, myth is itself a Greek term describing a story or account. And this is the critical part, that attempts to explain a subliminal kind of order, not a conscious, logical, rational order that is easy for people to spot. But we're talking Heraclitean hidden harmony here, subliminal, below the level, which even after this formulation, even after we tell the myth, even after we specify it, the myth specifies it in such a way that it remains mysterious and dark. It starts out mysterious and dark. It ends mysterious and dark. But now we know that it's there, operating in the dark. This is what he's saying. The purpose of myth, the finger pointing to the moon. We're not going to draw a picture and say there is no moon in the sky. There's only this picture. This picture is now everything you need to know. The way an equation does. The way that a simple natural law does. E equals mc squared. There, now you know energy. Done. It's not like that at all. It's more like saying, holy crap, there are werewolves. You better go get yourself some protection because, oh my God, werewolves. And, there's no equation to help you with werewolves. But the fact that you know that they're there means you can go get yourself some wolf's bane and some silver bullets and try to prepare yourself. But even after having done that, there are still werewolves, right? We're talking about danger. We're talking about threats to survival that don't operate within finite, easy to describe, easy to specify level of something like what is the pace at which gunpowder ignites? How much energy is produced from a liter of gasoline? We're not talking about that simple, trivial, finite mechanical stuff. We're talking about things like people's reason can be overthrown by attraction, Aphrodite. And there's not an equation that's ever going to help you with that. You just have to learn that it's more powerful than you are if you're not paying attention. This is about trying to teach you to respect the things that are confusing and irrational and that have authority over human beings. So in these two sentences, he's sort of restating what we've said before about the nature of the gods. They're not above nature. They are manifestations of the parts of nature that the ancients believe if we know what's good for us, we'll pay attention to those things because otherwise they'll steamroller right over us. It's like, if you live in a house with electric power, you have to teach the little kid not to stick the fork in the outlet. And if you don't teach them that, you should assume you're going to lose your kid. And this is how it is with them. You need to understand how Aries will mess with people's minds and make them want to kill each other. You have to understand that, no matter how prepared you are, when you put your boat out on the ocean to go trading, Poseidon might just take you down and keep you. You have to know these things because if you don't know these things, you are more likely to fail. These are the big things you have to keep track of. Totally different conception of the sacred, right? It's hard for moderns to understand that because we've rebelled against the medieval concept of the sacred. We think of faith as something you have to work for and commit yourself to. We think of religion as the faith itself and the struggle to maintain it. For us, the idea that no faith is required because the ocean's right there. You don't have to have faith in the ocean. The ocean's going to be there whether you believe in it or not. People's ability to be confounded by attraction is going to be there whether we believe in it or not. It is a completely different alien concept of the divine from ours. And that's what he's talking about here in myth. He's talking about here and what kind of dragons. We better learn something about these dragons. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah. I want to try to knit together because it really relates to what you're saying in a way. Knit together the fall, the Garden of Eden, with Plato. A difficult job. Because the psyche is part of a thing that's important. to understand because it has its own thing. And it seems to me that the fall from the Garden of Eden turns out to be an inevitable event in the creation myth, because we were given free will and a kind of complex understanding of the world, right? And God warned us, once again, this is a myth in the modern sense. God warned us not to eat from the apple, the tree of knowledge, right? Because knowledge itself is not survived because it doesn't have wisdom. And he threw us out. I'm not sure whether he threw us out or whether we left, because we got the goods, right? We don't need you, old man, you know? So I wonder, as they left, whether they didn't give the old man the one finger salute like this. You know, instead of this, yes, sir, God, you know, it's like, yes. So I wonder, and it seems to me wisdom, which is about how to actually, in a sense, integrate your knowledge in with your self-knowledge of yourself, which is a psychological dimension. And I think the psyche, you know, in the Homeric epoch was much more about just inner self, in a sense, you know. And I think when it came down with Plato, I think he tried to like integrate the psyche as both having knowledge and also having wisdom at the same time. I think that's an important development. And I think what happened there is, in a sense, how should I put it? It actually goes back to the Garden of Eden, because we were given a mind, and the mind wants to have, you know, wants to, in a sense, understand the non-understandable. That's a relationship between the finite and the infinite. You know, and I guess God's warning was like, you know, don't deal with the infinite, you know. Your understanding is not going to be sufficient. Yet we have in our psyche a desire to understand the infinite, at least in some sense. So to tell us, you know, you could just go ahead and make your tools. Don't bother thinking about what's happening. That's like saying that stay in the Garden of Eden and remain an animal. You know, screw that, you know, middle finger salute, right? But unfortunately, God is saying, you'll find out what this is going to lead to. The question then becomes, in a sense, if Plato was trying to weave together, in a sense, how to say, the Jungian collective unconscious in the forms and the representation of the world in terms of knowledge or what the thing is, how does that work? I mean, I think in some sense, I'm trying to figure this out loud. It's a little fuzzy. I think in some sense, okay, I remember once giving a lecture and I said, you know, reflection is a way to get at the both end of the objective knowledge and the psychic knowledge. Because reflection, when you look at the word, is a mirroring of your image. That's Narcissus looking at the pool water. Oh, like how beautiful am I, and how beautiful nature is, right? But reflection also means deep thinking, contemplation, thought, right? So therefore, in a sense, you're trying to we unite reflection as a reflection of the objective reality and the beauty of it, but also the transcendental thought of understanding beyond that and deep thought, which is wisdom in a sense. So the question is, I wonder whether in that reflection, there's a relationship between the imagistic reflection and deep thought. And I wonder whether Plato himself was not smitten by Narcissus himself. So there's a funny relationship there. And I think once we understand that, it to me, it really kind of explains this desire for us that we can't just stop with just mere understanding. We want to go beyond understanding, which is the desire to cross the divided line. The question I have is, at what point, and do we ever become the hero that we turn back to the Eden and say, God, now we have a deeper understanding? Are we forever lost east of Eden? And that's my thought. That relationship between the finite and infinite. How much of the infinite are we able to do that allow us to be the prodigal son returning?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether we can return home, because that's such a complex relationship between our psyche and reflection, deep thinking, and wisdom in relationship to knowledge.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it there. It's a tough weave, but I try to make it in.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, there are many. This is one of the things that is hard for moderns. There are many unanswered questions about what we're developing into and what our capacities are that we can't answer with the simple-minded, well, our minds are infinite, we can learn as much as we want to. Isaac Asimov famously said that in some of his works, that and in it he was just voicing the modernist confidence that there's no limit to the amount of information we can put in our heads, no limits to the amount of technology we can develop, and effectively we can be like gods. We just have to organize ourselves into the right machine to do that. And there's really no evidence that's true. There is evidence that we can go a lot farther than we thought we could, which is something completely different. But you watch some of those cosmological maps that people do now, where they say, okay, this is you, this is your planet, this is your sun, this is your solar system, here's a bigger star, here's, pretty quickly you realize, although it's impressive from our scale what we've done, it's nothing from the scale of the universe. It's meaningful to us and at our level, and not to be dismissed, but it's also not to be confused with being infinite. But moderns always confuse it with being infinite, because in our heads, having gone to the moon, we're also soon going to be on the Starship Enterprise flying through everything. It's hard for us to escape that visualization that we'll be able to teleport and manufacture something out of nothing and basically do all the things that we imagine the Old Testament God to have done that makes him God, right? To create something ex nihilo. This is our modern dream.
I want to mention Gustav Mahler, because I love Gustav Mahler. Gustav Mahler, in some ways, is a continuation of Wagner, but not a continuation, completely different psychologically. And Mahler wrote the Song of the Wayfarer. I guess that's the prodigal son that never returned home, forever lost. But then he wrote, actually, very interesting, the Songs of the Earth, which was his Ninth Symphony, because he was kind of like a little bit psychic, all the myth about all the great composers dying after they wrote the Ninth Symphony, such as Beethoven, right? He didn't want to tempt fate. So although that is actually his Ninth Symphony, he called it a song, okay? So that's interesting. Songs of the Earth, which means to return back to the earth in a way, in a funny way. And then he later on says, "Oh, I escaped that little thing. I'll write the Ninth Symphony." And he died. so don't tempt the fate. don't think you can outplay chess with the fate.
Oh my God!
But I think it's interesting that he wrote the songs of the Wayfarer, never returning home. But then he wrote afterwards the songs of the earth, which is returning back home. The prodigal son returns. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Phil.
Mahler is a wonderful, wonderful.
I love his music. Mahler and Sibelius, the major twin currents. So, you talked about we have this, like the cheetah wants to run, the cheetah loves to run, right? The leopard loves to pounce, the kingfisher loves to dive into the water. They don't just do it like a machine; they really enjoy doing it, and they long to do it again. Their arete draws them right into doing it, and things we long to use these mental cultural faculties that evolution has bestowed upon us. It's you can see it, especially when people are first learning to do it and they start to be successful. You can see, and many of us can remember what that was like, when we first started to get good at something, and then for a while that's all we wanted to do. Like, in that obsessive way that young kids without a lot of life experience can do. You're like, this is everything now. I need it. So this Hegelian, ancient Smithian kind of line of existentialism argues that these twin faculties that we have, gnosis and noesis, we want to do them both. We are, they are part of our arete. We itch to do them, and in doing them, in the same way that the run of the cheetah to take down the gazelle is in some ways the signature of the cheetah and of its arete. In the same way, when we write an exceptionally great mathematical paper, just ironclad reasoning, but also perfectly explained, very readable. That is our noesis signing itself. That is our faculty expressing itself. E equals mc squared isn't just a description of reality. In many ways, a mirror. It's the signature of noesis itself in action. And it's the same. What he's trying to argue here in this paragraph is it's the same with gnosis. You read Oedipus Tyrannus, and you see step by step how he has created his own calamity. And that is our own human gnosis signing its name, saying, my strength is the infinite that cannot be rationally understood. All those things that we can't pin down, there is a faculty for that in us. And if we're willing to practice it, it can become exceptional. And through most of human history, in most people, most of the using both faculties, it's something about the recent epochs and the way that they're culturally structured has tended to push for lopsided approaches to life, like the way modernity wants us to use only noesis and never gnosis. Right, that gnosis is vilified and scapegoated as the cause of all evil, and noesis is deified as the source of all good things. So if only we could be rational, bad things would stop happening, because we know nobody ever rationally decided to do a bad thing. This is not because it's true, but because it's an article of faith for the modern epoch, that nobody could ever do a bad thing. Just not possible. These are incompossible, as Kenneth Smith likes to say. Within our ideology, they're incompossible. Donald, go ahead. You got your hand up.
You've not mentioned on here, but Kenneth had a series of publications, Phantasmagoria, which sometimes I find myself, you can't quite grasp it for humans, how our arites develop out of our organic nature. But in Phantasmagoria, he has, I don't know, the age of insects, the age of reptiles, in which he then develops from their insect nature or reptilian nature. They have culture, ethics, civilizations that develop for these creatures, where Kenneth is unusually kind of explicit for him. He maybe wasn't on trying to out obscure Heraclitus at that point, but it's a context because we aren't in that. It doesn't require reflection to see it. It does require a reflection to read these and say, oh my God, that's true for us too. We just have to figure out what these virtues are for ourselves, you know. And I don't know if he has more copies or if they're still for sale or what the print runs were or anything.
I'm sure he has more.
You know, I think he only had like 500 or so, maybe a few hundred. He printed, they were very low print runs.
Yeah.
But
no, 20 years ago he had more. I bought them from him. He might still.
I bought them from him in the 70s, I think. But it took me decades to understand what he was trying to tell me. But it's the same point you're making about arete. And my only contribution here is these things are worth reading, because sometimes you can't see it in yourself, but you can see it in another. And well, that's better than never seeing it at all, I guess.
Right. Right.
So that's
Thanks
enough.
for bringing that up, Donald. Yeah, in doing that and saying he's going to do these philosophical comics, each of which is trying to focus on the psychology of like the age of insect. How does an insect see the world? How see the world? How does a reptile see the world? He's building off of Kafka's The Burrow. I don't know if everybody here has read Kafka's The Burrow, but in it, Kafka presents what he imagines to be the psychology of a mole. What does a mole cherish? What is a mole paranoid about? How does a mole make decisions? And in The Burrow, this mole is obsessed with the surety, the certainty that everybody else wants his roots that he's gathered up in his little food chamber underground. And he's constantly worrying about whether he has adequately hidden his entrances and is somebody else down here in the burrow with him. It's incredibly paranoid. And well, that's Kafka being Kafka. And then you think, well, Kafka's just describing the paranoia of real people. And that's all true. But Kafka's also trying to say, to what extent does character control your thinking? And he's doing it the way Donald's talking about, by giving you a tangible example that you could believe that this might be how a mole sees the world, right? I mean, if you were a mole, it's not hard to imagine these would be your concerns and your lines of reasoning, you know, because if it weren't, you could see Kafka's right. If the mole weren't thinking along these lines, the mole would be in trouble pretty fast. So there's as an illustration of the way that character is fate, right? Classic Heraclitus line. The Burrow and these Phantasmagoria comics are good examples. So what we're Microcosm, he's talking about myth, and he's the easy modern way to read this is, first of all, to say, well, that's all nonsense because myth is lies. And then we think that we're being enlightened when we say, okay, I understand it's not just lies. Maybe these were necessary tools for those primitive people. I can see how they might be necessary for them. But it's hard for us to go the next step and to say maybe myth is necessary for us as well, because maybe we're incredibly weak in one of our two mental faculties, because our education, our economy, our politics, everything about modern culture tells us that one of our faculties is all good and the source of all virtue, and the other faculty is all evil and the source of all bad things, and ergo we should suppress the one and just use the other. be out of balance. And that what he's describing here is not an attempt to say, how is nature or how are the gods really? It's an attempt to say, what are the sorts of things we could understand if we had not neglected the developments and proficiency in our gnosis? If we hadn't made ourselves so one-sided to be strictly noetic, or as in the terms that that Nietzsche uses for gnosis, he used Dionysian, and for noesis, he uses Apollinian. You know, if we weren't so ultra Apollinian, if we were in balance and had equally developed our faculties, our Dionysian faculties, then would we be better able to deal with the limit? Would we be better able to deal with the subconscious desires and urges and ugly parts of ourselves and admit that they're there and come to terms with them, rather than pretending they're not there and then just erratically acting out on them and not being able to understand why? Now, anybody who ever went to counseling over anger management or, you know, addictive behavior or dysfunctional family cycles has had to have that discussion with their therapist, which is, I don't know why I do these things. I don't know why my model of myself is noetic. They don't have the word, but if they did, they would use it. My model of myself is noetic. I have a script for who I am, and yet I do these things that don't fit the script, and I can't explain it in terms of my script. I can't understand it at all. The moment moderns venture outside of the tidy part of the land of theory into the untidy part of the irrational, subconscious, and deep principles of the cosmos that don't care whether we understand them or not, we're just lost at sea. And we need somebody else to guide us, because that faculty is withered in us to the point that we're just completely, you know, out of our depths. Donald, go ahead. I see you came off mute.
Yeah, it's a small thing, but Plato uses the term pseudosmythos when he means false myth or lie. You know, he has an explicit term for that. So I think you can deduce that myth was not viewed. It's more like it's I think of it as sort of a meta view, or something that's like, Zelig isn't here, but you know, he talked about Gödel, that there are unprovable truths, that
Yes.
myth is a pathway to accessing unprovable truths about ourselves.
Yes.
And we can't, they're not within the system. They characterize the entire system, to
Yeah.
use my noetic mathematical thinking there for a little bit.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
you know, the only way I can express this is in symbolic terms.
Yeah.
But you know, but there's no sense that mythos is false. They have the term. They use it, pseudo mythos. You know,
Yeah.
and I don't hear him. I don't know if he ever said a lethos mythos, the true myth, but I don't recall that from reading. But
Because it's the default, right? He
Right.
knows that myth by nature is a kind of truth, unless it's pseudo mythos, right?
Right. That's some of this is too far back in my memory, but I think that's right.
So what we're talking about here in this paragraph is what, as equations and logical syllogisms are to noesis, myths are to gnosis. What is the proper formulation of the kinds of truths that don't lend themselves to systematizing? We talked before a few months back about how challenging it is for moderns to distinguish between the finite and the infinite, because even the infinite we try to reduce to a triviality, right? Like the integers, we say that it's infinite because they go on forever. But you can write that as a simple little equation, as a summation. You can say, yes, recursively, we can always add one, the end. That's it. I've now characterized an infinity, but that's not the kind of infinity that mythos was designed for. That's still finite. It's a trivial infinity. The kinds of infinity that mythos is designed for is like characterizing life, right? So by life, I mean the biological life, that every living thing that we know about anywhere on Earth is made of cells, and the number of cells is uncountable. We will never live long enough to go out and count every cell that's there. And on top of that, the number of living things is changing. So even if we had the count right for a split second, it would be wrong again the very next split second. We can't pin down what that number is. So it's effectively an unknowable number. It's constantly changing, and it's too big for us to count. But even if we could count them all, the cells are always dividing. Their new cells are being born, old cells are dying, there's splitting and differentiation happening, right? So they're moving around. The number of living things is changing all the time. We also know that no two cells are identical, because, I mean, from the outside as an abstraction, we can wave our arms and say a cell is a cell, but that's like saying a person is a person. When you actually get down with a microscope and you start studying a living cell, you realize that it is supremely well adapted to precisely where it is, right? Saying, what is it taking in? What is it giving out? What is it storing? Which proteins is it manufacturing, and what balance? All of that is because the cell is in a relationship of symathesy with its larger environment. And its environment, the environment of every single cell, is different from every other cell, right? The cell that's in this knuckle of this finger is not going to be the same as the cell in my tongue. They have different environments, and they're adapted to different things. Look, I hit that cell, right? It's doing something different right now in response to being struck than the one in my mouth. It's still tasting the yogurt I ate. So no two cells anywhere in the cosmos are the same. Right off the bat, that throws us out of the realm of equations, because they're not just quantitatively different, they're qualitatively different. And there are ways. I'm a neuron cell, right? Different from a taste cell, different from a skin cell. They're different. And even if somehow we could characterize that, the fact that because they're alive, because they're in a sympathetic relationship, whatever they are at this instant, they will be something else in the next instant. They will copy different proteins, they will copy different nucleotides, right? The membrane will enclose some new thing and bring it inside itself. They don't even hold still. So they're infinite in at least 3 ways at the same time, orthogonally to each other. There's too many of them. They're all different from each other, and they're all constantly changing. There will never be an equation for that. This isn't like saying there's an infinite number of integers. The radically different scale of infinity. And if we say that everything can be turned into a logical syllogism or mathematical equation, then we are also implicitly saying we are never going to understand life, because it can't be. We have declared the limits of our own knowledge, that we've by restricting ourselves to noesis, we've made ourselves clueless about the most important thing about ourselves, that we are alive, in fact. It's like, if we can't talk about even the simplest aspects of life, then what the hell are we doing? Now, the fact that I can, make a sword and cut somebody else in half is, handy if I'm a medieval guy in a war. But, for a wide range of things, it'd be useful if I could talk about these complicated infinities that don't lend themselves to logic, right? And of course, part of logic, I say, doesn't lend itself to logic, and that'll offend all the logicians, except the truth is that nature doesn't care whether it makes sense to us. Nature makes sense in its own terms, and its terms are infinite terms, not finite terms. So, I could be building the world's most elaborate, sophisticated logical syllogism from the moment I'm born until the moment I die, which is impossible, but let's imagine, with no rest in between, and I still couldn't keep up with reality, which is just on a whole other scale. So it's never going to happen. I can't use noetic tools to characterize these kinds of infinities, but I can use myth. Because the purpose of myth is to give us the finger pointing to the moon. It's to use analogy, to use metaphor, to use analogy and metaphor in a different way than noesis uses them. This was Gödel's critique, right, of systematic reasoning. He says systematic reasoning attempts to be precise and complete, but by definition, whatever it is that it's trying to describe, it's going to omit something that it should have included, and it's going to include something it should have omitted. The system can't be perfect. But what for those things that that are in the center of its target, in the middle of its wheelhouse, like E equals mc squared as applied to a nuclear bomb, it's right. It's correct. It gives, that the answer does in fact come back. And that is a particular kind of expression of reality, description of reality, that noesis craves and loves. But it can't apply to the kinds of infinities of infinities of infinity, qualitative infinities that we're talking about when we talk about the unconscious, when we talk about these deep principles of life and so forth. For those, it has to be something other than an equation. And so even though E equals mc squared is a metaphor, it's a model that claims to be close to reality. And that's its nature. That's what makes it scientific. The difference between that and myth is that myth is a metaphor that makes it obvious, is not attempting to substitute for reality. To say that the ocean is Poseidon is not to say it's a dude. This is the difference, right? To say E equals mc squared is to say that E does actually equal mc squared, and that's the way it is. But to say, beauty is Aphrodite is not to say that beauty is literally Aphrodite. There's no way to express the myth to make you confused between the two objects of the metaphor, what it's describing and what we're describing it as. The myth basically puts right in your face the inadequacy of itself. It says, I'm trying to describe something and I will fail. And if you try this, you will also fail. But this attempt at least captures some of what you need to know. That's what myth does. And it says that it's doing it. You see how that's the opposite of E equals mc squared. E equals mc squared is trying to be complete and say, for the thing I'm describing, this is everything you need to know. But for the myth of Oedipus, trying to do the right thing and instead bringing down calamity, the myth is making it obvious that this isn't even close to enough. And it will never be enough. But it is a finger pointing to the moon to say, understand the nature of tragic inversion. Understand the way they become weaknesses. Understand the way in which, as finite creatures in an infinite world, we are always struggling against things we don't understand. And that's not going to change. And as long as we know that's not going to change, we have a chance. But the moment, like Oedipus in that first play in the trilogy, the moment we confuse what we understand for reality itself, we set ourselves up for tragedy. When dealing with these infinites, it's fine to fall short as long as you understand that you're falling short. But if you fall short and you believe that you have completely captured it, like E equals mc squared, if we try to do that, that's when we're setting ourselves up for catastrophe. This is why noetic expressions are good for certain kinds of descriptions of reality. Certain aspects of reality lend themselves to that. But other aspects of reality, the worst thing you can do is to try to put an equation on them. Because the very worst sin you can commit at a mythic level is to think you've got a complete description. By definition, since we're finite and it's that qualitative infinity, it can't be complete. And grokking that and hanging on to it and knowing it as our orientation as we explore the unconscious, as we explore our own motivations, as we explore the qualitative qualities of the cosmos, that sets us up to succeed, as long as we remember that success is always going to be partial, aspectival, glancing, imperfect. That's why we need the two tools, to deal with the things we can characterize precisely and to deal with the things that could never be characterized precisely, at least not by a human being, not by a mortal. Actually, Eric asked an excellent question. Do you mind if I bring the question forward, Eric? So he asked, why are you conflating unknowable with infinite? And this is what's critical here, is to a human being, to count as infinite doesn't even require that it be infinite. It just has to be so big we could never We can never get a handle on it. And I think of this as, although in history this is explained as the finite versus the infinite, that's the shorthand. I think religion has sort of missed the boat on this. It's not actually finite versus infinite that's the problem. It's practical versus impractical. There are things that we can get a grasp on cognitively or behaviorally or with our tools, and there's things we can't get a grasp on. And it's not just that we can't get a grasp on them because our technology isn't good enough, but because no technology will ever be good enough. Like this issue of all cells everywhere, all the time, all different from each other and all changing. It's impossible to keep up with that. You need a universe bigger than this universe just to represent that constantly changing state. So, we can call that the infinite, but you're right, it's a kind of conflation that I'm doing. Only doing that because that's the term that's been used historically to describe this problem, the finite versus the infinite. But you're right, that's not actually what the problem is. The problem is what lends itself to mortal understanding and control, and what is simply beyond us. It's that we can only ever get at in a glancing aspectival way. And that we're okay as long as we know that. But we're not okay as soon as we think. It's like people who in their search to understand God get confused and start to think they speak for God. A problem that we see all the time with televangelists and others. The problem there is that they've crossed over into that line of dealing with the infinite, which is maybe the unknowable, have you, in a way that is only appropriate for finite knowable things. Thinking that God is now limited to my finite understanding of God sets us up for failure, right? We start to project our own biases and believe that. When I say so he posted he wouldn't say that the heads of the Manhattan Project would agree that E equals MC squared was a complete understanding. Yeah, so they had some very good brains on there who understood that they were dealing with something much bigger than they thought they were dealing with. But in conventional understanding of people, let's say science students. And I love science. I study it endlessly. I study science, but it's not until people get to an advanced level of understanding in science that they come back around on the circle to understand that it's our understanding of our ignorance that's what makes science so powerful. Knowing where the limits are, knowing where the boundaries are, what are we pushing, what do we know and not know? That's when science gets really interesting. But there's a long stage of engagement with science that comes before that, where people confuse what we have learned for the sum total of science. They don't think as clearly about these boundaries. So all the terminology that I'm going to use to talk about this is going to be inadequate because I'm pushing up against the very things that moderns have a hard time talking about. The ancients didn't have an easy time talking about it either. Unknowable, what can be done in a lifetime and what can't be done. What can be done maybe not in an individual lifetime, but if a culture can keep itself together and keep building on its past knowledge, what can it reach that it couldn't reach before? All these kinds of issues are very complicated. They're very complicated. And the purpose of myth in the sense that he's talking about in this paragraph goes very much to, you said, I am become death, that famous quote. There's a reason why at that moment he steps aside from noetic formulations of what they're doing to mythic formulations, because that's right. When you're dealing with what we don't know, you can't put an equation, by definition, you can't put an equation to it yet. And myth's power to refer in an open-ended, suggestive way is incredibly helpful for dealing with that. It's I almost think about it like there are these almost lost grammatical constructs in English distinguishing to from toward. The suffix ward or wards, leeward, for example, you're saying, I'm not saying it is precisely there. I'm saying it's that away. English used to have a lot of finesse in being able to talk about the difference between I know exactly where it is and I'm telling you exactly where it is versus it's somewhere that way. That ability, I think of that in some ways as the between the powers of noesis and gnosis. Noesis can say, it is right here precisely, E equals mc squared. And gnosis can say, I am become death, destroyer of worlds. It's like, this is scary, folks. I can't give you an equation for how scary, but oh my God, you looking at what I'm looking at? This ability to summarize experience in a way that sticks and is memorable and helps us to separate the foreground of reality from the background of reality, to pull something to the foreground that might have gone unnoticed, even though it was important, and give it an emotional charge so that it can stick. That's where myth, not Donald warned us against, but where real myth can really help, is to help us to not overlook things that are messy and not very easy to characterize, but are nevertheless very important, maybe even more important than things we have better pinned down. Phil and then Geneva, and then we'll go back to the text. Go ahead, Phil.
You know, I like Hegel quite a lot, but I've always felt that there was something that I disagree with Hegel, and it's becoming clear to me. You know, speculative philosophy, which I guess emerged out of Kant in a way, was taken forward as the way to broach this relationship between the knowable and unknowable. I'll still call it the finite and the infinite. And I was thinking the other day, actually this was doing a, maybe it was a discussion of a Hegel relationship with Kant. And speculative philosophy to me seems like is sort of like anticipatory philosophy, right? You speculate, you anticipate what's coming, and through the process of negation and seeing how it go. And the problem I have is that it is sort of exactly what you're saying, in a sense, is that I always suspect, and I think Hegel actually says this, I'm not a Hegel scholar, so I'm not going to claim absolutely, that at the end of history, absolute mind will get you to a total understanding, right? So we're not there, but we're evolving and moving in that direction, in the step-by-step negation of speculation. And that's a way to broach it. Otherwise, you're stuck with, Kant, in a sense. We're not going to touch the noumena. All we could do is talk about what is. Okay, so that's one step ahead. But it seems to me, when you take a look at Hegel, in actuality, he's always kind of like looking forward by looking backwards. This is how history has developed. Okay, I'm not going to disagree with him, although there's parts I would sort of say that maybe he mischaracterized it, but generally speaking, it's true. But that's all you know in terms of projecting into the speculation in the future, because you don't know what's out there. You only, in a sense, be hinged by the past. And so, like, to me, it's like driving forward in a rearview mirror, right? So there's something funny to that in the sense, and it's kind of like a preemptive move to project into the future what is postulated from the continuation of the past in some form and in its transformation. And to me, like, he reveals it in a way in his contradictory statement, right? The owl of Minerva takes flight in dusk. But the speculation is done in daylight. I mean, so like, I mean, it
Yeah.
does, it will push forward, not necessarily because speculation, because you have to do something. And so I wonder, like, should he say the hour of Minerva takes flight in midday? I mean, if he's going to be a speculative philosopher, but he says, at dusk, although I guess it's not totally dark yet, but it's at dusk. So there's a little bit of light. So maybe it's not totally like driving with a rear view mirror. So he's talking about a kind of speculative philosophy is kind of a movement by momentum, right? In other words, you project your car at a certain speed, the momentum will carry you forward, even if you take your foot off the accelerator. So I wonder whether he should say it's just moved by just the roll of history, and you will know when you get to it. Oh yeah, that's what happened. I mean, so it's actually in a way not speculation. So why is he front running what is going to happen by what will happen? I mean, the problem with speculation, and I mean, all the futurists always miss the mark. They always miss the way off, right? And so speculative philosophy is a kind of futuristic philosophy that speculates, but
yes,
not that the speculation is not reasonable. It maybe is even practical. So in some sense, Hegel is really, at best, really a practical philosopher rather than a theoretical philosopher in a funny way, because he will explain, this is what happened. And to be honest, I don't know what will happen, but we're moving in that direction. It is moving. That part I like, that part I agree with. So, but the front run, what will happen in a funny way, somebody mentioned that front running, what will happen, in a sense, truncates freedom. We already know what's going to happen. Don't bother thinking about it. Just follow the yellow brick road. So I don't know. I mean, so that's a disagreement. Like I said, I basically like him a lot, but there is that part that the front running, is kind of like predicting. The Rams will win by 2 points.
right, right.
You might be right. That's playing poker with the future. Okay.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of absurdity to philosophy. One of my favorite Shakespeare quotes is, "Lord, what fools these mortals be." And in that moment, Shakespeare was, channeling the ancient Greeks. That was their conception, is there's just an absurd amount of foolishness in being finite. Walking around not knowing what matters. It's like, I've got these kittens, and they don't know what matters and what doesn't matter. They don't know what's going to happen, what's not going to happen. They got up on the counter the other day. We have a plate out that we keep some treats on in a little bottle, so they're not accessible. And they were exploring up there, and they step on the edge of the plate, and were amazed that the plate flipped into the air and went off the counter, and fortunately landed on some towels. So, nothing broke, but they were shocked. I mean, who could have imagined that you can't step on the edge of a plate? And I realized that I'd forgotten that lesson decades ago, because, everybody over a certain age has learned that it acts like a lever. If you push on the edge, it's because the base is for. To the kitten, this was new and amazing. And, he's having Puck, the most ridiculous of the divine beings in A Midsummer Night's Dream, physically ridiculous, behaviorally ridiculous, but still at least semi-divine, and therefore of the infinite, comments on observing the human beings going, "Oh my God, do you see how absurd? They're like kittens." He's having them say. So, there is something absurd about philosophy. It's like, why do we want to be philosophers? What do we think we're going to get out of it? And if you read Hellenistic accounts, if you read Diogenes Laertius, you'll see him talking about how Thales got rich because eclipses. And this is the conventional pop culture version of why you get into philosophy, so that you know things. And if you know things, you can control the world by your ability to see the future. And that's still, if to people who imagine that philosophy isn't just absurd and ridiculous, who think that philosophy might be worth something, the majority of them think that it's going to give them some ability to predict the future. It's why when people get exposed to Kenneth Smith and his critiques of modern culture, they almost always want to know, well, so what are you saying we should do? Right? What's the prediction? What's the right thing to do? And Kenneth's like, why would I know that? I'm an existentialist. I'm trying to help us understand where we are and why things are the way they are now. I'm not claiming I'm a god who can force a mortal. The future is the undiscovered country. I don't know what's there.
Well, let me just add one point. I should have added this point. Like currently the economy is by most experts, is in a very bad shape because it's global, and there's tensions and geopolitical tension, geopolitical tensions, certainly between China and the United States. There's also a problem with the war in Ukraine, which is going to have a devastating effect in certainly the European economy and global food supply in the coming future. And yet the market right now is moving up. And I was listening to somebody, he says, the market is moving up because investors are ignoring the fundamentals of what might happen, and it's driven by momentum. Because like when people buy in, what happened is other people buy in. The machines are pre-coded at a certain line. When the 50-day line curve crosses the 200-day curve, that's called the golden cross. You should go. So it's driven by let's see, what is it? Technical motions and the momentum. And the momentum will carry you so far. Just like I said, the analogy of the gas pedal, once the car's got momentum, it'll move a certain, but it's just like when you throw a ball up in the air, you stop throwing, the ball will continue. But at some point, the gravitational pull, it will come to a stop and then it'll start falling. And I think a lot of people are short-sighted enough to say, let's chase the momentum. Now, I guess the really smart money, not a smart money, will chase the momentum and leave before it peaks. And they can have a short gain, right? Just take the gains. And as a matter of fact, that's what the poker players do, in a sense, because we have a speculative market, is that what they do is they funnel money in, draw the suckers into the momentum play. They say, oh, yes, the market had bottom. Let's go for it. And then the pros then, put puts on it and sell, and they'll gain. And the poor suckers end up losing. So there's also a psychological dimension in that, by pulling in the suckers that will be the followers. So it's gotten so complex. I mean, I know that I can't deal with it. I certainly may be able to deal with the momentum, but I can't deal with these speculators who are professionals. It'd be like me playing poker with a professional. They know how to lure you in and take the money, and they know when to stop. So it's once again, it's the momentum play. So don't be carried away with the momentum. Okay, I'll just stop there. Thanks. Sorry, Geneva. And
so, before we go on, I do want to stress, that part of, understanding how to interpret what we're talking about in this series is that what Kenneth Smith tries to say, that if we can learn enough about the ancient worldview to be able to slip in and out of it, and if we can learn enough about the medieval worldview, again, in its own terms, not in our terms, but in its own terms, to slip in and out of it, then our toolkit for interpreting reality has just tripled. But right now, as moderns, we're prisoners of a single worldview. The epoch encourages a certain way of interpreting reality and ourselves and meaning and so forth. And it's so strong and natural to us that we don't even know we're doing it. We're not aware. We're like fish swimming in water. We think that the water is just the way things are. We don't know that there's alternatives. So he's trying to get us to understand the ancient worldview in its own terms well enough that we could actually choose whether or not we wanted to try to interpret something that way versus a modern way. And so when we talk about myth and we talk about psychology and the way that the mind works and all this, we may or may not be talking about how things really are, because we're talking about very complex, nigh infinite things, right? And we're trying to describe them as very finite mortal beings, right? So we're going to be approximating here, but what we can do perhaps by doing this is get the ability to change which biases we're seeing the world through, have a bias in the first place. You shift from the modern view to the ancient view, and certain things that we think are features of the world suddenly vanish. They were cognitive illusions that were generated by the way we interpret the world. And as we shift into the ancient worldview, other things will appear. Some of those will be cognitive illusions, but some of what appears will be things that were there the whole time, but that were lacunae from the perspective of the modern worldview. They couldn't be seen from that angle. So that's what this is all about, is just trying to shake up the tools we use for interpreting the world. That's what this whole project is about. Not to claim that we're precisely defining how the human mind works or how human culture works or all that. We may, and Heraclitus says that, but we're not claiming to know the answer. We're just saying these are different interpretive systems. And it's helpful to be able to shift between them and not just be trapped in the same labyrinth we were born into. Geneva, then Stephen. Go ahead, Geneva.
Yeah, I kind of thought we'd gotten away from the question that I wanted to ask, but now that I think about it, maybe we haven't, because you talked about setting up for catastrophe some little time ago. And my question was, well, is that necessarily a bad thing? Because I don't think that people set out to set up a catastrophe, but whatever they set out to do could end that way. And that is yet another way, I think, of learning how not to do what we've been doing. And then you talked about the kittens, because I thought for them, that was probably a catastrophe, like stepping on the side of the plate and whoa, how did that happen? So now they have to figure out, was that a good thing? It's catastrophic in their minds, I think, but now they have to now they have to figure out, well, is that something we really want to do, or do we want to do something else? And how do we want to do it? And even with Phil talking about his playing poker with a professional, that could be catastrophic, but it certainly would be a situation where you could learn, oh shit, this is not what I want to do. This ain't working. So I better try something else. So I'm not sure that catastrophes are a bad thing. But when I hear that word, I think, oh, this is horrible. No, we don't want to do that. But then I think, well, based on my life, catastrophes have been the catalyst to get me to do something different. And it might set up another catastrophe, but I at least have to weigh and measure and figure things out from a different perspective.
Right.
So I think that's kind of what I was getting at. And I think you guys kind of made my point, actually. Yeah.
But you made it very clearly. So I'm glad that you brought it up. We learn by making mistakes, because making mistakes, or rather, if we learn by making mistakes. There's plenty of people for whom their ideology is so strong that, if they would rather not admit a mistake ever happened and, just kind of push that aside and suppress it. But when we're at our best, it's that we pay attention to the deltas between our expectations and reality.
Geneva, just don't go all in.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Like, lose a little, dip your toe into the water first.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the case of the kittens, of course, they were not expecting an alarming noise or this plate to go flipping end over end through the air. So both of their tails poofed out like this was just yesterday. They're like, "Dad, it eats me," and it took them a moment to go, "Okay, it doesn't eat me." It was loud and scary, but
Yeah.
maybe we're okay, right? Like you say, they can learn something from it. But there were all sorts of things they could have paid attention to in the room at that moment, but that would have required knowing not to step on the edge of the plates, right? Which they didn't know. How could they have known? They'd never done it before. It was a novel. It was a novel experience.
Yeah, and I guess it works the same way with mankind in general.
Yeah.
And moving forward, or like one step forward, two steps back kind of ideology, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
This is why we are tiny excited chaos. They're constantly discovering the world. Stephen, go ahead.
One of the pitfalls I keep on noticing is that dichotomy between the objective and the subjective. And what we overemphasize the objective and forget the way that the subject, it's the subjective where the desire comes from. The subject sees the object and has all sorts of grand visions of how great it will be. The subject will see a sports car and they'll have all these dreams. How, if I have a sports car, it'll feel fantastic. Every day will be a dream. It will be a chick magnet. And then, of course, they encounter the reality, and the reality is not as good as the dream, and people wonder why. Well, our subjective dreams are going to be optimal about the outcome. Our subjective dreams are not going to dwell on the pitfalls. If, as a teacher, you start teaching students, beware the market, beware this trip, eventually they're going to make you drink hemlock for corrupting the young. People just don't seem to understand this, that this subjective dream you have is what pushes you as an animal to go and do things. But your imagination is always going to be optimal. You're always going to imagine the best outcome and ignore the pitfall. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, these are challenging issues. So before I call on Phil, I'm going to take us another sentence forward because we want to, we got a half hour left. We can make more progress through this paragraph. Next sentence, in myth, men accommodate their intuitive minds. And that means their gnosis, right? He's talking about their gnosis. Men accommodate their intuitive minds that nature itself imposes on them. So he's linking myth to gnosis explicitly here, although he's not using the word, but that's what the intuitive mind is. And he's also making the connection that we've talked about before between gnosis is ideal for an experience of life that is a pathos, that we are suffering, whereas noesis is a form of thinking that's ideal for a form of mind that's a praxis, where we are exercising our will and trying things. And this distinction between pathos and praxis is built right in here, between suffering, not necessarily as a bad thing, but suffering as experiencing what life has to give us, is willing the world to be different than it is and trying to bring those changes about. So myth is not fundamentally about. This is another way in which myth as the expression of gnosis versus equations and syllogisms and laws as the expression of noesis. Myth is also expressing the way that it's expressing experiential wisdom is by making the person who hears the myth experience the myth just like in their everyday world they would experience the actual world. there's no shortcut to going through the story and feeling the story, living, because that's Gnosis's mode of learning. That's how Gnosis builds up its store of understanding, not by memorizing facts, but by going through the roller coaster of emotions associated with the experience. And that's why non-finite qualitative infinities, as those aspects of reality, can't be described in terms of simple equations and syllogisms, because this is information that can only be experienced. You can't memorize something. There are two different modes of learning. They're absolutely radical modes of learning. And this is hard to say in English, because we have these generic words like learn and know and remember that seem to suggest that they account for everything, right? Learning is learning. There can't be radically incompatible modes of learning that can't be expressed in each other's terms. That the word to learn doesn't have any room for that, right? You can learn anything. Or if you can't learn it, it's unlearnable. But the idea that it can only be learned using one faculty of the mind, but not the other, the word learn leaves no room for that possibility. And the same is true for our word to know, right? You know it or you don't know it. There isn't with one faculty, but not with the other, and vice versa, because these words exclude the possibility that the mind is structured that way, and that information is structured that way, and that therefore our ability to interpret the world around us has to be structured that way. You know, I when I was looking at these older lost words in English, like conning, not to fool somebody, but to study through intense experience, right? So when you learn dance, you don't learn it by attending lectures on dance and then one day you can dance. You have to experience it, and you have to experience it in a way in which you are intensely focusing on what's happening to you. How does this feel, right? The mistakes I'm making as I go, but all does it even feel? What is the experience like? Conning, this old lost English word, is to learn through experience in that way. And if you con sufficiently, then you ken the subject. Now I know dance, not through lectures or ideas or ideologies about dance, but through having danced. It's a different kind of understanding than what I can get by reading a book. And as a result, turns out the word can, the English word can, originally was part of this system of words. I can do this originally meant I can because I conned it, I ken it. And therefore I can predict the future and say that I can do it again. That was the original system. Can wasn't just, sure, why not? Or I feel like it. Can I have an apple? There's a reason why people used to make the distinction, may I have an apple versus can I have an apple? So you've had apples before, I'm pretty sure you can have an apple, but you may not. You're asking the wrong question. We're not asking about your capabilities that have been the result of experiential study. And so it's, that with that whole line of words lost, it's hard for us to even conceive of experience as producing a kind of knowledge in the mind that you can think about in a way that is radical. Think about what you learned in a lecture, that they are not the same kind of stuff in your head. And that if you try to think about experiences, experiential knowledge, if you try to reason about kenning, that we can sort of imagine. But what we can't imagine is a correlate to reason in which we are thinking without reasoning and producing ideas that are not reasonable, rational ideas, but that nevertheless are building off of our experience, off our kenning, and developing new insights that have no way to be expressed in rational, logical terms. The structure of our language has made it impossible to express the idea of a thinking that's not reasonable, rational thinking. but that nevertheless produces things of value and produces them from experience and not from theory. There's no place for this in English. You could write a book just trying to make clear the distinctions involved here, but these distinctions were easy to say in ancient Greek. They were natural. That was the way they saw the world. And we can't see the world that way, so our language won't let us. We've been taught not to. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I want to go briefly back to what you said about the three different ways of seeing. So we have expanded our toolkit in terms of understanding the world in a practical sense. 2 days ago, I was at a meetup with of Heidegger, going through Kant, talking about Kant. And somebody made a funny remark, and somehow Newton came into it. We were talking about, like the orbits of the planets and so forth. And Newton came up. And then somebody said something funny, and he concluded, well, like you got to take into account chance goes into this, because what if Newton had not been sitting under the apple tree? So that was funny, right? Like, by the way, which relates back to the apple and the Garden of Eden. But nonetheless, I just sort of mentioned it in retort to that. I said, yeah, you're right. What if he was sitting under a banyan tree? There would be no causality. There will only be the eightfold path. I mean, like, don't restrict it to the Western tradition. There are other toolkits as well. I mean, if he had sit under the banyan tree, Newton would come up with a totally different idea about the relationship, not the causality, but the nirvana, which is, by the way, into non-being. So that's interesting. So I just thought I'd say that because you've been talking about the three Western traditions, and then tangentially mentioning, like Babylonia and Egypt, maybe embracing them as the Western tradition, but nonetheless part of it. So just say all understandings in some sense have some modicum of wisdom to lend to this thing. It's not just the Western three, not just the big three. We like to reduce everything down to the big three. Oh, sometimes the big four in basketball. Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Phil. Let's see. So yeah, I'm just, for those who want to play, I'm just throwing these verbs in here. So there's to con and to ken. And you'll see examples under con where it talks about the eagle high atop a tree conning the landscape, right? It's not in a class learning about what landscapes are supposed to be like. It's studying the experience through direct experience. And, you can then look at the verb ken, and, in all of these, you can find some contamination of modernity. You can find alternate definitions that do use the rational noetic ideas of know, but you can also see the traces of the older experiential concept of knowledge. And it's when you see under ken that can is a derived term, that I can do something is related to I can it. That's why I can do it. This is when you start to see this whole system of words that used to be present. And if it seems like a stretch, it's because I previously did studies on land words in English that are lost now, like the relationship between hill and dale and hurst and dell. And there's all this terminology that was systematic that we've lost. And I did a big table of correlatives looking at unto, therefrom, leeward, and so on. As you can see, structurally, English had this really sophisticated grammar for describing relationships between things, and now it's almost all gone. If we use most of those words now, it sounds like an archaism, like we're just being hoity-toity. But really, there were all kinds of very precise things we used to be able to say that now we can't say at all. We're just sort of vaguely go to and from, and that's about as far as we can get. And that's because it wasn't it's not practical anymore. A cunning plan that cannot fail, says Baldric. Go ahead, Donald. Oops, sorry.
Well, I think other languages may still have something like this. In German, that quote you had the other day, we have kennen and we have wissen. Kennen, to be familiar with, to acquaintanceship, sort of. And wissen is the way you know science or mathematics or something. And French has connaître and savoir, to know and to know. I mean, they get collapsed. I mean, these are all points when you study these other modern languages, they say, and oh yes, and you English speakers are going to have to really think about which one to use because it's gone from your language. This distinction of familiarity versus noetic knowledge versus gnostic knowledge.
Yeah, that's right.
So that, like in that quote you had, or that translation of Heraclitus, you know, Kent was definitely Gnostic. Not only that, it was sort of a reflexive form of kennen, erkent.
Let me drop in the quote you're thinking of from the Philosophy of Geist, which is there it is. Know thyself, he says, erkenne dich selbst. So the gnosis, the gnothi of gnothi seauten, he translates as erkenne. And I ran through, and it's definitely derived from the same term that Ken is derived from.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just gone.
Yeah.
It's only
your Scots.
We only kept it in Scottish or something.
Yeah, the Scots care about these things.
Yeah. Well, they hold on to a lot of stuff, like every nickel they've ever made.
So yeah, the first quote from the Phenomenology is the famous quote from Hegel that to us is for that very reason not recognized for what it really is. And recognized is the key term here. When translators are trying to translate Hegel into English, bekannt, erkannt, it says it ends in nicht erkannt, not recognized, except erkannt, which is related to erkenne, means a whole lot more than recognition. When you are thinking in a gnosic way, you are not merely recognizing the thing. You are re-experiencing it. You're reliving the reality of it. And that brings with it the total experience that it belongs to. It's a way of knowing things by knowing the whole of what it's a part of. And it's a way, not abstractly. You can't erkenne something that you haven't actually lived through. Right? It's knowing things you haven't lived through is what the other kind of knowledge is for, memorizing and practice, doing your tests and drilling and so forth. That's the noetic form of learning things. But this erkannt stuff, erkenne, this is the experiential kind of knowing. So the fact that they all translate it as recognized is because they all insist on translating it into modern English. And we have no word for this verb. It cannot be expressed in modern English. They really ought to be borrowing a term that actually means that, whether the German or the Old English or what have you. But because they are obsessed with the idea that English must be a universal language that has every conceivable concept you might ever want to express, they're unwilling to borrow. They believe it would be a failure as a translator if they were to borrow a term and import it into English. And ergo, it means that they are doing the very thing Hegel warns about. They're creating a flatland in which they're doing a lossy translation from the original meaning into what's possible to say in English. Go ahead, Donald.
I was going to say, people on here occasionally mention Heidegger. He did the stuff of Heidegger that I really have read has been his stuff on the Greeks, where he breaks down the Greek into its roots, translates those into German roots, and then coins brand new German words.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, and it works.
Yes.
I suppose you could do it in Old Norse or Old English or something and produce something that an English reader could read it and say, you know, I've never seen this word, but I think I know what it means.
Right.
Because it hits those fundamental roots. But you know, that's one part of what Heidegger did that I really like, is to get really good translations, because it enlightens. Well, it makes so much more sense of the Greek.
Yes.
You know.
Yes.
Let you. Well, enough.
Well, know thyself is the classic example, right? Because we've always translated it that way, because know is the only verb we've got. And the idea that there's a whole other missing verb and a whole specific way of knowing that is therefore know thyself is also simultaneously commenting on the strengths and weaknesses of the two different mental faculties. All of that's lost in English. I mean, it's unthinkable and inexpressible. And it really suggests that in the same way that Nietzsche started out as a philologist before he became a philosopher, it's modern. It's going to deal with the Germans and the Greeks and others really requires philology to be a part of it. We've got to be willing to innovate linguistically, which I know goes against the orthodoxy that, you know, all attempts to shape the language are evil, and we must merely that prescriptivists are all horrible people who hit our knuckles with rulers in school, and we must all be liberated free descriptivists now. That is to say, absolutely under no condition should we become architects of our own language. We should passively experience whatever the market wants to give us. You know, this is, you know, I think we have to basically break with that orthodoxy in order to practice philosophy in English at all.
Yeah, either that or they're very long translators notes that accompany every book where you
Yes.
define your vocabulary.
Yes.
You know, otherwise we can just say this is a special terminology like computer science creates in order to befuddle people.
That's right.
Except electrical engineers, they befuddle us.
That's right. That's right. What's this AND gate you're talking about? Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I really appreciate all this you're saying about language, because it's important. But we must not give up and things are hopeless. I'll give you a personal example of that. When I was trying to write, I'm not a very good writer. I'll acknowledge that from the beginning. But I did do some writing, and I started out writing about, you know, explaining my work, because I just want to claim this space before it was preempted by, you know, the critics and so forth. So when I started writing at all in a serious way, it was a very arduous task in which I had to write and rewrite and rewrite. Usually I would write it beyond 100 rewriting. That's a lot, okay? Sometimes even more than that. In fact, I made a art exhibition in that regard, which I actually show the painting on the top, and then I show the explanation, show all 114 of it leading up to the thing, okay? And then one day I decided, you know, I'm gonna, because I found in the rewriting that various words, even now, have so many meaning depending on the context, okay? That's why I keep rewriting it, because I kept trying to twiddle the context and make it fit in the right way, even in my limited skills and the limitations of English. But then one day I had a really, really special idea. I said, instead of rewriting it, why don't I in every step of the way try to define the multiplicity of the words I discover, First of all, I discovered that in my writing, about 70% of them have multiple meanings, depending on the context. So that made it very complicated. And what I did was I just wrote the word down. I wrote the number of definitions, and then, and I made a glossary each time around. Then I go on the next one. Of course, everything changed. I had to rewrite the definitions and glossary. It was extremely exhausting. Okay. So after like 100 different transformation, it became so complex that all the writing and rewriting, like I said, it was a creative process. I mean, if I was a true writer, this was very avant-garde because I was inventing all those relationships. But to me, it was like looking in a deep well, which all the words are floating around, and I'm trying to reach into it, trying to find a meaning to it. I just got so confused by it that I kind of stopped writing because it would just be beyond my capabilities. But the aspiration of that for somebody who is actually a very good writer, fluent writer, understand the language better than myself, it would be very avant-garde because what it does is open up words and relationship to other words. So the textualism in the relations of words completely change, not completely, quite a lot modify the meaning of what I'm saying each step of the way. So it was a very avant-garde creative process that I just couldn't handle. It would be like me trying to juggle, like 100 balls at the same time. It's just like beyond my capability. But I know that the impetus of that was a very creative process that exploded the possibilities a lot. If I was doing art, which I have talent in and I have the capability in, that was exactly the motive, what a creative process was. And so I just want to tell you, it's not hopeless. That
Yes.
aspect of interpretation is still very open. You just have to pry it loose.
Yes.
In some sense, right? Instead of saying, go by the definition, because even as it exists, like I said, 70% of the words, in fact, I made with the display of that last piece, I actually made a written piece in which I actually cast the words in a very projected font, and all the words that wasn't redefined in the final piece was in black, and all the words was in that was redefined was in red. So it actually became a visual display of what of what I was trying to do. So if I was to display that, what I would do, and I did display that, but I didn't include it, is to do that and show my glossary of all the transformation that took place to arrive at the final destination. It could have probably gone further if I hadn't gotten actually dizzying and almost ill trying to figure out all these things, because it's like swimming in, well, what Heidegger would call this sort of like circle, the hermeneutic circle interpretation, which I did not have a firm grasp of. So I just want to say, it's there, it exists, creativity is still possible, multiplicity still exists, even for amateurs, such as myself.
That's right. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, this is a point that's often made in traditional Okinawan martial arts, that whether or not we can ever be as good as our sensei is the wrong question. The question is, can we be better tomorrow than we are today? And this applies to this issue with the finite and the infinite. It's like, okay, so what? So we can't be the Genesis God, and we can't know all things and make all things. So what? We can still learn to do better tomorrow than we have done today. We can learn to understand better and have a better, healthier impact on things. And partially that's about discovering the optimism that's suitable for a finite being, which is, yeah, if you set yourself an impossible task, you'll spend your whole life being frustrated that you can't do it. But if you focus on know thyself, if you focus on who are you right now and right here, you will discover, a bounty of tasks you can take on that you can do and build a track record of success with. Things worth wanting and worth having, perhaps. It's partially a matter of perspective. So yeah, there's this isn't all about pessimism. It's about learning not to sabotage ourselves by and I speak as somebody who in my career has often set myself up impossible goals and then been frustrated that I couldn't get them done. And in hindsight gone, the mistake was not the failure to achieve the goal. The mistake was setting that goal in the first place. That it's not, I learned a lot. I got a lot done. Progress was made. I could look at the exact same situation and be celebrating instead of grieving, as long as I understand the arbitrariness of the original selection of the goal that was out of reach to begin with. So, Donald, and then Stephen. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, we're all here reading Kenneth, one of the world's great masters at unfinished, unpublished books.
Yes. And we're reading one of the unfinished, unpublished books.
Right. I think somewhere I've got several others that I was sent to comment on over the decades, and I just, they just didn't come out. But Phil makes me think a lot of Borges's The Library of Babel. Phil, just produce all of those things, all of the books. There'll be one that'll only have a minor punctuation or a slight typo or something. There'll be an infinity of books that'll be all almost identical, differing just by minute amounts. And we can just read them all. They put them all in the Library of Babel, where all the other books and all their infinity of variations lie. And we can read them all.
Yeah, Borges. Kenneth Smith loves Borges. He cites him as, if you're trying to understand mythos, you should definitely read Borges, because he does some great mythic stuff. So, Stephen, go ahead. Come off mute.
Okay, since we're talking about myth, I wonder what you think about the myth of Midas meets Silenius. Midas seems to have been the Greek equivalent to Elon Musk. Everything he touched turned to gold. Yeah. And yet he seeks the wisdom of Silenius, the satyr, and the satyrs seem to be like our town drunks. It's like the homeless man today who's on drugs.
Except divine.
And so how do we find this guy after a night's riotous drinking? He's going to be dry. He has to slake his thirst in the morning when he's woken up out of night's deliriums. And this is when Midas captures him. And okay, what do you know? Silenius? And Silenius, of course, says, "Why should I tell you what it won't profit you to hear?" I was just wondering, what are your thoughts, or Kenneth Smith's thoughts on that legend?
And that's one of Kenneth Smith's favorites. You've picked a good one, and of course the end of the story is, Midas presses him, and what Midas wants to know is, what would be best for man, and eventually Silenus says, what would be best for man is never to have been born, or failing that, to die swiftly. And what the point of this, there's several points to this. One is Midas is the classical Elon Musk of Greek myth. As far as we know, he was Lydian or some neighboring group, and they were the ones who invented coinage. They invented them as the tokens you gave to the goddess. So turning everything to gold was literally true in the sense that you would bring your chickens or your fruit or your olive oil or what have you and trade it next to the temple for the token, the gold token, which you would then take to the temple with your prayer and deposit. So the invention of coinage, the invention of currency, and everything that follows from that was essentially attributed to Midas and or his forebears, relatives, what have you. So there's good basis for him being the Elon Musk of his era. And with all that wealth that they accumulated, those kingdoms were able to do amazing things, make amazing constructions, architectural statues, and so forth that the rest of the Greeks envied and wanted to emulate. He really was. So the fact that he uses his power to capture a god, even though Silenus is the least of the gods, as Stephen says, it's the town drunk of the gods. Right, the night after the party, it's just completely sloshed and ow, everything's loud and my head hurts of gods. But still, to the ancients, to be a god is to be a different order of existence from a human being. We are finite and mortal, and our understanding is so blinkered and limited that the most basic fundamental truths of reality are out of reach for us. That's why we're always asking, what does life mean? What should I do? All these questions. The gods are like, you don't even know those things? how do you even get from one place? How do you even, to use the modern parlance, this is like, I'm looking at the kittens flipping the cat off the counter, the plate off the counter going, how do you even? It's like you're moving around. Lord, what fools these mortals be, says Puck. So Silenus is like, on the one hand, oh God, the kittens have captured me. And they're asking me a ridiculous question. But also, being divine, they have access to the truth. Not every truth, but the basic truths of the divine, plus the more esoteric truths of whatever they're the best at. And Midas might have been better off asking Silenus some profound question about drunkenness, and could have learned something that Silenus's expertise. But instead, he wanted to ask what he thought of as an ultimate question, but what Silenus thinks of as one of the basics that silly mortals have no access to for whatever absurd reason. And they couldn't handle it if they could. And that whole, you want the truth, you can't handle the truth. But Phil likes to quote that line from the movie. This is the moment when Silenus, captured by mortals, i.e. tied up by kittens, is being forced to tell them something that he knows they don't want to hear. Because he's divine. Why would he settle for the absurd, ridiculous limitations of a finite being? I mean, it is unthinkable to the gods, at least to the ancient gods, to want to be human. Because how painful would it be to not only lose all the power, not only lose all the knowledge of your specialty, but even lose the most basic understanding of life and what it means to be alive, to be as completely baffled as a human being. So Silenus gives a classically misanthropic answer. And Kenneth Smith shares this story for two reasons. It might even be somewhere in this book, but if it's not, it's in many of his other books. He cited it more than once. And it's for two reasons. One is to say the Greeks believed that the gods pitied us for what it's like to be finite and mortal. They could only imagine how painful that must be. They would never want to be that. And the other is that, there's three. Sorry, three. The second is that the god's telling the truth. It may be a wretched mess of a god hungover after a night of partying, but it's still a god. And gods deal in truths. Especially they deal in infinite truths that are out of the reach of mortals. So the Greeks are saying this is not only what the Greek gods think of the Greek people, but this is actually the truth of the Greek people, that to be mortal is a miserable existence. You can see this in some of the quotes from the lyric poets before the age of philosophers, where they're talking about how frustrating it is that They said the three great frustrations of mortality, that we die, that the things that we create also die. We build temples, we build countries, everything we make falls apart. So we can't even make something that will outlast us forever. The things that outlast us are also finite and mortal. But they said the worst of all is that we're so goddamn stupid. This. I talked about this book a year ago that I got. That's all full of lyric poets from the pre-philosophical era, and they said of the three deficits of mortality, what the Greeks hated more than anything is being stupid. And when Silenus says what he says, one can assume it's not really for the first two reasons, although that's how most people would read it, that it must suck to die, and it must suck that everything that you make will eventually fall apart. But that the real reason is, how can you be so stupid that you don't know the meaning of life? Because all the gods know. It's obvious. It's like being a kitten and not knowing that some things fall over. Not knowing that if you lean into a pet to be petted, you're going to fall off the couch. How do you not know gravity? How do you even? So that's the second part. The third part is that the Greeks were misanthropic, and they were misanthropic because they were trying to claw their way out of a dark age, and they were frustrated with their own history, and they were frustrated with the sense that however far they managed to claw themselves out of this dark age, because of the nature of their own character, themselves as Greeks, they thought that there was a good chance that even the new Greece that they were creating was going to be short-lived too, and they were right about that. They didn't know there was going to be a period to follow, and that they were going to have an influence for eons to come. But they did know that all the signs on the wall suggested that this new thing they were creating was not long for this world. So they had a kind of realism that a modern would take for pessimism. Because as moderns, we try not to think about these deep questions. We try not to think about mortality. We think of death as the worst possible thing, and the best possible thing would be to live forever. But to Silenus, the worst possible thing would be to live forever, but be so stupid. It's like it's good that we only live for a while, right? It limits the scale of the catastrophes we can create. It's good that we are not omnipotent, that we don't have Genesis God's powers to create, because we don't have Genesis God's omniscience. And to omnipotence without omniscience, as Nietzsche reminds us, would be a disaster. So there is a way in which our scale is correct, right? That we have limited powers and that we have a limited life, which we think of as curses, are blessings, because they allow us to restrain our vices without making it impossible to still do good things, right? What is the scale of the landmines we can set on our own path? It's limited because we're not omnipotent. So it's possible for us and other people to get around them. It's a good thing. And this is why, to the Greeks and to a lot of ancient cultures, the goal is not to personally be all powerful and all knowing and to live forever, but to do your best and to give your best to the culture so that it can take the gifts that you bestow and try to make something better from them. We're each just passing the torch. And it's why the Olympian run starts the way it runs every Olympic Games. From person to person to person, you pass the torch. And you leave your problems behind when you die, and you pass on the good things so that the next runner has a better shot and is further along. All of this is built into the myth of Silenus. It's why he quotes it so often. He loves it. I love it too. Thanks for bringing it up. Phil, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I'm more struck by the fact that you take the golden coin to the temple, or the silver coin, whatever the coin was, to the temple, offer to the gods. Do we not recognize that that's a bribe, or at least as a transaction? Human beings participate in transactional relationships, but it seems to me the gods probably don't do that, And so, and that, of course, migrated to indulgences in the Middle Ages. Like, how is it that you could bribe a god? I mean, you shouldn't even try, because it's offensive to do so. It's even offensive to human beings, let alone the
Yes.
gods. So
They meant
that's
something
interesting.
different. They meant something, the ancients meant something different than the
Okay.
medievals meant. So the ancients, the gods didn't want our treasure. They didn't. They talk about the fact that Hades is the richest of all the gods because the earth is full of gold and gems and all that. And he doesn't care about that stuff. He's like, if you look at his realm and what he's focused on, he's dealing with the souls of people. That's what he's interested in. And Poseidon was the second richest of the gods because of all of the ships that sink, which was part of the warning to mortals. You want to be a trader, you want to set out on the waters, you might be rich, or you might just give more money to Poseidon. And he doesn't want that stuff. I mean, he has it, but it's meaningless to him because it's just that stupid stuff that mortals are obsessed with. They saw, and that's why the Midas story is a cautionary tale. The touching everything to gold, is a curse rather than a blessing. But they said the challenge is, how do you get a finite being to respect the infinite? And the only way that you can do it is to get the finite being to be willing to give up something precious to it. Because even though we want the wrong things, we do in fact want them. And so giving up the thing that we want so much at least expresses our interest in transcending our personal desires. That was the purpose of the ancient giving of the coin, right? Because remember, you're buying the coin with chickens or olive oil or what have you. They already have the coin. But you're exchanging for it and then giving the token to the goddess, for example, in the Temple of Artemis, which is part of why Ephesus was so goddamn rich. You're giving the coin because you want it, and you're giving it up, not because Artemis wants. Artemis doesn't want your coins, but you have made the sacrifice, which shows that you are capable of taming your own desires enough, at least this much.
It seems to me it would give your soul. I mean, it seems to me giving your soul is to become virtuous. I mean, that's what the gods will really want, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the closest thing. I mean, even though that's still a human thing. So, but that's what I mean is like, it just seems like we take what we want and think that that's what the gods want. I don't know.
Exactly. And this, by the way, as Kenneth Smith says, is the secret behind the story of why you put coins on the eyes of the dead for the ferrymen to cross. The reason that you give your last obol to Charon at the river Styx is because it's not going to do you any good in the next world. Nobody wants it. So there's no point in bringing it with you. You hand over your last obol and you go naked into the underworld without the things that don't matter, that you were so obsessed with during your life. And you take just your soul. What did you make of it in your life? How did you cultivate your character to make of it a worthy gift? So on that note, we'll pick up again next week. And again, I'm counting on David to copy the text because I don't know why Zoom no longer allows selecting the text, but it used to.